Good evening. Welcome to the special meeting of the Livonia Public Schools Board of Education, August 14th, 2017. Mr. Centers, would you please take the roll?
Mrs. Bonifield.
Here.
Mrs. Bradford.
Here.
Mrs. Frank.
Here.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Here.
Mr. Johnson.
Here.
Mr. Centers is here. President Burden.
Here. We have a quorum. We have two meetings this evening. The first meeting that we're entering into right now, our special meeting, is going to be relatively brief, but we have some exciting news for our community. We have many members of our Cooper community here to celebrate with us. We will be following this meeting by a lengthier committee of the whole. So those of you who are looking for several of the agenda items that are scheduled for this evening, if you're not hearing your items coming up immediately, just hang on for a few minutes and we will be going into a second meeting almost immediately following this meeting. This meeting, as we said, is a special meeting, so we'll be handling just a few brief items for both that have been discussed mostly at previous meetings. Audience communications is coming up next on our agenda. If you would like to participate in audience communications, you can find a blue slip just outside in the hallway. I don't see any right now. If anybody cared to participate in that, you can take this time to do so. Also, if you're looking for agendas either for this meeting or for our committee of the whole, they can also be found, if you're in attendance this evening, on the table just outside our doorway. If you're following along from home, you can follow our agenda on our website. That's www.livoniapublicschools.org. If you hover over the board tab, you can drop down to agendas and follow along. I do not, as I said, I do not have any blue slips. Is anyone present in the audience who wishes to participate in audience communication this evening? All right, seeing none, we're going to go to item 3, appointment of upper elementary school principal. And may I have a motion from a member of our board, please?
President Burton.
Mr. Johnson?
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and appoint Shalonda Owens as an elementary principal at Cooper Upper Elementary School beginning August 15th, 2017.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Johnson, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. Mrs. Opist, are you going to address this item, or would that be Mrs. Scott tonight?
Thank you, President Burton. Mrs. Scott is going to get us started, and then I will jump in.
Okay, Mrs. Scott.
Thank you, President Burton. A thorough interview process was conducted to fill the position of principal for Cooper Upper Elementary School. This process consisted of the administrative team screening qualified candidates, interviewing the selected candidates, and then conducting a second interview, which included the candidates preparing for a performance task. Following this in-depth process, the candidate had a final interview with Superintendent Oquist. We believe Shalonda Owens is the best qualified candidate for the position and recommend Shalonda Owens as the principal of Cooper Upper Elementary School. Shalonda comes to us with 13 years of teaching and administrative experience in West Ottawa Public Schools, which included teaching grades 3, 4, and 5, and holding administrative roles of assistant principal and principal. Her latest position was the principal of Pine Creek Elementary. Shalonda prides herself with leading and learning beside staff to prepare students to be positive contributors to our community. Shalonda earned her Bachelor of Arts and Master's from Grand Valley State University. She is currently enrolled at Michigan State University, working toward her Doctorate of Educational Leadership. Her area of study is focused on developing collective responsibility within a school community to provide the best learning experiences for students. Words used to describe Shalonda were thoughtful, motivational, team player, develops leadership, and collaborative. She is known for her passion and the relationships she forms with students, staff, and parents. At this time, I'd like to defer to Superintendent Oquist to say a few words about Ms. Owens.
Thank you, Mrs. Scott. President Burton and Board, we are very pleased to bring this recommendation to you this evening. As you know, our district goes through an extensive process that begins with gaining input from our colleagues and the staff at the school at which we're filling the vacancy, creating a profile for the leader based not only on that input, but the input of our cabinet team and their work with that particular school. That is a guidepost that we use throughout the process, through the screening process and the interview process, to make the selection and recommendation of a candidate. Ms. Owens has extensive experience in working with the Title I supports for students, with regard to school improvement, the MTSS, which is similar to our Operation Student Success, her district bond committee, too bad we're already done at Cooper, but we could tap that expertise elsewhere, working with English language learners. And really a key portion of her work involves shared leadership and involvement of staff in decision-making at the school, and engaging kids and engaging parents in meaningful ways. And she's been able to see significant increases in parental participation, which has been very, very meaningful. Her superintendent shared with us that Shalonda is someone who is put in the places where they need to make where some of their most important positions, because they know that her efforts are tireless, and her work with students and staff is really unparalleled. And so we're very pleased to bring the recommendation to you this evening.
Sounds terrific. Are there comments or questions from members of the board? One of the comments one of the characteristics that resonated most with me was collaborative responsibility. It is certainly a goal of Livonia Public Schools, something that we practice each day and something that we can always get better at, and something that is first and foremost in our minds. So to have someone joining our administrative staff who has that specific talent is going to be just a wonderful addition to Livonia Public Schools, and we certainly look forward to it. Comments from any other board members? Seeing none, Mr. Senator, would you please take the roll?
Absolutely. Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield,
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mr. Centers says yes. President Burnham.
Yes. Motion passes. Congratulations. We'd like to welcome Shalonda to come up and say a few words if you'd like.
Thank you.
Welcome to the community.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank Superintendent Oquist and Mrs. Scott for the warm introduction. I appreciate the kind words you just shared about me. And also, I'd like to thank the board members for giving me this opportunity. I am extremely excited to join Livonia Public Schools, and just thrilled about this next journey and learning with new colleagues, new staff. I want to thank Cooper's teachers for coming to support me today. That's just very telling of the community that I'm joining. So I'm very excited to be here. Thank you.
Terrific.
Right.
We're happy to
Thank
have
you.
you.
So thrilled to have you on board.
Again, congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'd like to just thank Mrs. Collier, our assistant principal, and all of the Cooper staff who, again, joined us here this evening for a warm welcome to Ms. Owens. We greatly appreciate that.
Absolutely. We have a couple of more housekeeping type items that we're going to take care of, after which the board will take about a 5 or 10 minute break or so we can congratulate Ms. Owens and welcome her a little bit more casually to our community. After that point, we will be coming back for our Committee of the Whole meeting. At this time, we are going on to item 4 of our agenda, first reading of Board Policy JDAAA, Emergency Use of Seclusion and Restraint. Mrs. Oakes, would you like to address this item, or Dr.
Thank you.
Terrell?
I'll just start with sharing with the community, and just as a reminder to the board, this is a topic that we've covered in our study session previously, and we had shared with you also that we would be bringing forward the modifications that you had requested when we first reviewed this policy. Dr. Terrell will share with you the impetus for needing to bring this forward to the board at this time and prior to the start of the school year, and also share with you a highlight of the guidelines from the MDE on this important topic. Dr. Terrell?
Thank you very much. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
As we have discussed previously at a study session and a Committee of the Whole meeting, the Michigan State Board of Education adopted the policy for the emergency use of seclusion and restraint. The intent of this policy is to ensure that seclusion and physical restraint are used only as a last resort in an emergency situation and are subject to diligent assessment, monitoring, documentation, and reporting. Districts are required to adopt a policy consistent with the MDE policy. You have a copy of the 25-page Michigan Department of Education policy that outlines the specific supports, training, requirements, definitions, and procedures required. Our board policy, JDAA, includes these components, and I've updated the language as Superintendent Oquist indicated per your request. I will now read the policy. Again, board policy JDAA, students, emergency use of seclusion and restraint. The Livonia Public Schools Board of Education, Administration, and instructional staff recognize the importance of supporting student conduct to maintain an atmosphere of quality instruction in order to promote school achievement. It is the policy of the district to provide a safe educational environment for all of its students. Students' behavior at times may necessitate the use of emergency seclusion and restraint in order to maintain the safety of the student or others. The administration will utilize 1, proper procedure for seclusion as outlined in the Michigan Department of Education policy for the emergency use of seclusion and restraint. 2, proper procedure for restraint as outlined in the MDE policy for the emergency use of seclusion and restraint. 3, annual awareness training for all staff. And 4, proper training for key identified personnel in all schools. The school district shall adhere to the policies and procedure in accordance with the MDE policy for the emergency use of seclusion and restraint. I'd be happy to answer any questions at this time.
Other questions or comments from members of the board or the superintendent? Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you, Dr. Terrell. So this is just a reminder that, as Dr. Terrell mentioned, the MDE adopted this policy, and then it went to the local county ISDs. And we were fortunate to have members of our staff serve on the committee at Wayne County RESA. Then Wayne County RESA went through their processes with regard to recommending this policy and these procedures, and then made those recommendations back to the local school districts and superintendents, and we received that a couple of weeks ago. And that's what we went over in great length. Dr. Terrell went over each section of that policy with you. So this is something that is across the state, is happening in every local district. And again, the policies are intended to follow very closely the MDE guidelines that were established and then those that were reviewed at each individual ISD.
Are there any comments or questions from members of the board? Mrs. Bradford.
When will the training take place, or when will they train everybody, and about how long does the training take?
That's a great question. The key identified personnel were trained August 10th here in the boardroom. So we did crisis prevention training for our key identified personnel. They also received the state-approved seclusion and restraint video that was put on by a law firm. So they have received that training. First aid training will be put on prior to the beginning of the year as well by our Administrator of Security, John Raymond, for staff. For our annual awareness training for all staff, I will be meeting with all of the elementary principals and all of the secondary principals to present this video, again, state-approved, to all of the principals, and then they will be presenting it to their staff for the annual awareness training for all staff who have any contact with students. The key identified personnel, again, are those key people who will be called upon should emergency use of seclusion or restraint take place in one of our buildings.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Mrs. Bonnefield.
If someone was interested in reading the state policy, could you let us know where to go, possibly online, to find that document?
Absolutely. If you go to mde.gov, it is located on the state's website.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Any other comments or questions from the board? Seeing none, we will not be taking a vote on this item tonight. This is up for a first reading tonight, and any changes to our policy require 2 readings at 2 voting meetings. So we will be voting on this item at our next voting meeting. Thank you very much, Dr. Terrell.
Thank you.
The next item on our agenda is item 5, first reading of board policy JD, student discipline. Mr. Archibald, you're up.
Thank you, President Borton, Vice President Burton, members of the board, good evening.
Good evening.
Again, we reviewed this at the recent study session, but I would like to provide a little bit of the background and then walk you through the revisions to Board Policy JD regarding student discipline. And I believe Mrs. Wozniak had included information in your packet, but then you were given a revised version tonight. Is that correct? That's the copy that we'll be going off of. That's the most accurate version. In background, there was some legislation passed in December of 2016 that takes effect for this current school year related to student discipline, student suspension, and expulsion. The legislation is aimed at eliminating zero-tolerance discipline policies, in particular with regard to weapons, arson, criminal sexual conduct, and assault. Currently, the legislation states for students in grade 6 or above, the student who violates one of those offenses shall be expelled for a minimum of 180 days, and it's a lesser number of days for grades 5 or below. In summary, the changes brought about through this legislation, again, all but eliminate zero-tolerance policies, with the exception of possession of a dangerous weapon. They identify 7 factors that must be considered before suspending or expelling a student. I will review those when we review the policy. And it provides for restorative practices to be used as an alternative to suspension or in combination with a lesser suspension. Board Policy JD, Student Discipline, and Administrative Procedure JD, Student Suspension and Expulsion, have been revised in consultation with our legal counsel to reflect the necessary changes under, again, this new legislation. If you would please go to, take a look at the Board Policy JD. The first is a series of changes just involving the penalty for each offense listed. Currently, the penalty ranges from suspension to expulsion, and that's been revised, eliminating suspension and adding, replacing it with the term warning. Therefore, the penalty will range from warning to expulsion. Okay?
So that would not preclude suspension from being used, just to clarify that, but it's
It would
a wider
start with a
range.
warning, and then it could be
It could be anywhere within that
suspension all the way
range
to
for
expulsion.
those offenses,
Okay.
yes.
You can flip through several pages, and you'll see for all of those offenses listed, and I believe there's 22 of them, all the way through V of the alphabet, and if V is not the 22nd letter, I will work on that tonight. But again, in each instance, in terms of the penalty, ranging from warning to expulsion. Moving over now, if you would locate Section B, the title is Definition of Discipline. You'll see in addition to the definitions of suspension and expulsion, we've added the definition of restorative practice, which are practices that emphasize repairing the harm to the victim and the school community caused by the pupil's misconduct. Section C is new. I will read that. Factors to be considered before suspension or expulsion. Section 1310D of the Revised School Code requires school officials to consider each of the following 7 factors before suspending or expelling a student, except for students being expelled for possession of a firearm in a weapon-free school zone. 1, the student's age. 2, discipline history. 3, disability. 4, seriousness of the behavior. 5, whether the behavior posed a security risk to any student or staff member. 6, restorative practices. And 7, whether a lesser intervention would properly address the behavior. Please note, restorative practices may be used in addition or as an alternative to suspension or expulsion. Except for students being expelled for possession of a firearm in a weapon-free school zone, the above 7 factors shall be considered prior to any decision to suspend or expel a student, including an initial decision to suspend or expel a student for an appeal of a decision to suspend or expel a student. School officials shall document their consideration of these factors. An editorial note for you, that documentation will occur on a referral form, which we will revise for the administrators to use. And then continuing through the changes, that section C is new. So what you see there is section D, and that simply is just changing the letter. That was formerly C, it's now D. And again, the same, the next section was section D and now becomes section E. So again, the substance of those changes to be consistent with the legislation regarding to the elimination of zero tolerance discipline policies is to revise the penalty for each offense to range from warning to expulsion and to include those 7 factors that must be considered before a student is suspended or expelled.
Are there questions or comments from the superintendent or members of the board? Mr. Centers?
Sure. The one thing that I've learned with my time on the board is that oftentimes matters of student discipline are not necessarily black and white, cut and dry. So this is something that I'm certainly in favor of. There's a lot of times there's a gray area, there's circumstances surrounding discipline, and when a board's hands are tied, we may have to follow the letter of the law, even though it may not feel like the most appropriate consequence for a student. So this will allow us to be a little more reflective and thoughtful in these circumstances, and hopefully it will ultimately help students.
Thank you. Mrs. Jarvis?
Thank you. On a more technical note, just one issue I'd like to point out on the first page in the second paragraph, the last sentence. Penalties can include warning, restorative practices, suspension, expulsion, or.
I'm sorry, can you tell us where you are again?
I'm on the very last sentence of the second paragraph.
That's potentially ominous.
Got you.
Or,
Okay.
right,
So
that-
what's not clear?
Yes.
Thank you.
right, it leaves a lot to the imagination.
Thank you.
Or
Or,
How about
whatever.
for expulsion instead of expulsion or?
I will clean that up, I apologize.
thank you.
Mrs. Bonnefield?
How is this going to be pushed out to the district? When will that happen? And can you maybe tell us a little bit about, I know restorative practices are somewhat challenging and can actually, interestingly enough, it actually needs training in order to sometimes do some of the deeper restorative practices methods. Can you just talk a little bit about, how that's going to go?
Yes. In terms of pushing it out, we shared this information with administrators when it started coming out after the first of the year. We will again review it with them at principals' meetings that are coming up prior to the school year, as well as sending the information out to them so that administratively they're able to update their student handbooks and be on board with the considering the 7 factors and the restorative practices and so forth. At the secondary level, we had a committee that has been working for the past school year and a half on finding alternatives to suspension. And so that this tied in nicely with that legislation. So we've been working on reviewing how our planning rooms function, trying to make them more supportive of instruction and student learning as opposed to just a place for a timeout. And so we've been working on that. We have 5 or 6 members of our administrative team, including student services, elementary administrators and secondary administrators who have gone to workshops regarding restorative practices and the new legislation. And so we will use them to, again, help get the word out and train our administrators, particularly with respect to the restorative practices. On a simple note, a restorative practice could be an apology or restitution or community service or something of that nature. We have used a lot of those types of practices in the past. One where we will continue to do more study and work on is a restorative circle, which, to my understanding, requires much more training in an environment in which you bring the victim and the perpetrator together And obviously with all the proper permissions of the parent and the willingness of the victim, and with a very well-trained staff, work through repairing the damage that was done, and again, in what I believe is referred to as a restorative circle. So I think on the early stages of restorative praxis, we'll continue to do the things that we have been, and with this group that went to the workshops, we'll continue to explore using the restorative praxis on a bigger scale, district-wide.
Thank you.
Comments from superintendent or others?
I just want to be sure that the board is clear on what we're voting on. So could we review Mrs. Jarvis's sentence?
Yes.
So the sentence currently states penalties can include warning, restorative practices, suspension, expulsion, or. So obviously, we'll take out the or at the end. My recommendation would be we either have two choices, which we could move the or to between the words suspension and expulsion, and simply read penalties can include warning, restorative practices, suspension, or expulsion. Or another option could be penalties can include warning, restorative practices, suspension, expulsion, or other appropriate consequences. Certainly, can allows those to be options, but it's not all-inclusive. It doesn't say will. And so I believe we have other options, but as you know, our teachers, our administrators, our staff across the board utilize a wide variety of tools with regard to age-appropriate consequences. So we can certainly leave it to those four items because the wording can include. We could also just make that a bit more broad and at the end add or other appropriate consequences.
May I offer a third option, not to try and confuse things? Would we simply state that penalties can include consequences ranging from warning to expulsion? Again, just covering that range that we include on the offenses, and we talk about restorative practices elsewhere in the policy.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
I like the option because it's more reflective of the rest of the document.
Sounds good to me.
It's broad, I
Yeah.
like that,
Yeah.
it gives you,
I actually like listing some of the items that it can include. The specific offenses that are listed later in the document cover warning to expulsion. But I'm in favor of our policy reflecting the fact that we're looking at restorative practices as being an important part of our discipline process. Therefore, I'm more inclined to support the suggestion that Mrs. Opus has given. Penalties can include warning, restorative practices, suspension, expulsion, or other appropriate consequences. I could live with both, but that's my 2 cents. Mrs. Jarvis?
I agree with you. I like that phraseology. It does, it reflects some of the bigger things that we're thinking about and that our district might utilize, but it also, it states that there might be something that doesn't fall
Fit in
within
the-
those ranges and
fit in
that
the
it's
box.
more student-oriented and personalized.
Mrs. Bonnefield?
I'm not going to dig my heels in on anything. I would rather not have the and other at the end. I would rather it just end with suspension or expulsion, simply because it's directly related to what the policy is talking about. And when we start adding and other, then we're adding words that we're not backing up in the policy. They're just kind of superfluous, and we don't back them up with anything. So I think if we want to list out the 4 items, I'm not opposed to that at all. But anything beyond that, I think, goes outside of the scope of the policy.
And the policy does say can include. Mrs. Bradford,
Oh,
do you want to jump in?
No, I'm
Mrs. Jarvis?
thinking.
Okay, I'm going to take back what I said earlier. Reading the first paragraph, it says, rather, this statement covers only the most serious and obvious types of misconduct, and the following rules are not to be construed as an all-inclusive list. So it does make sense to only list the discipline penalties for things that are the most serious and obvious types, which, in the past, didn't include the restorative practices, but I'd like to see that listed now, because that is the heart of this change.
I agree. I think that sounds good. I'm with Liz.
So we're kind of going back full circle to just Moving the "or" is the appropriate spot in the sentence.
I think so.
For those of you
For
who may
me,
be
at least.
listening, and maybe we made mud for the rest of you, because you're not looking at it in front of you, we are back to the sentence of a lengthy policy, but the sentence reading, penalties can include warning, restorative practices, suspension, or expulsion. Any other thoughts or comments on this?
I'll just give mine. I think
Go right ahead, Mrs. Frank.
I do like other appropriate consequences because my life is in elementary schools right now, and there are there's a huge continuum of that sort of thing. But I also agree with this is for extreme offenses or the very most serious, so I could go either way on it. But I do like the inclusion because, especially for elementary, younger kids, there is a huge spectrum of discipline that is available to them other than these, but I could go either way. Is that helpful or not?
But
Mrs.
the,
Bonnefield.
Mrs. Bradford.
Mrs. Bradford, sorry.
That's okay.
We have too many Bs on this board, I'll tell you. Myself being one
I
of them.
agree with that, but I do think the restorative practices, doesn't that include other appropriate consequences? So we wouldn't really need that statement because restorative practices kind of includes other appropriate things. I mean, that to me, restorative practices has a lot of different types of discipline. So we perhaps don't need to leave that on.
Other comments, Mrs. Jarvis?
The authority of the schools to deal appropriately with lesser infractions is covered in the first paragraph.
Others? Anybody else who's not jumped into the fray yet?
I can live with either one.
Okay. I'm hearing somewhat consensus on penalties can include warning, restorative practices, suspension, or expulsion. Is that correct?
Yes. sounds good.
Okay, all right. We will take that phrasing then to the second reading. I do have one other suggestion that I'd like to make. On item C, which is a handful of pages back into the policy.
On section C or
Section
on
C,
offense
I'm sorry,
C?
section C.
Okay.
Number 5, where it says whether the behavior posed a security risk to any student or staff member. I would like to suggest that we consider changing staff member to others. So it would read whether the behavior posed a security risk to any student or others, because there may be times that the behavior posed a threat to a volunteer in our building or a guest in our building or so forth, and that's somewhat consistent with the phrasing change that we made in the previous policy that we just discussed. We changed staff member to others, because it might be another individual who's in our building who does not fall under the category of either staff member or student. Any thoughts on that?
Do you see it? Do you know where
I
it is?
think
Okay.
that's a
Oh, I
good
do
suggestion.
see where
Okay.
she's, yes.
Yeah, I think that's a good
I think
suggestion.
that's a fine suggestion.
Okay. Fair with that? Okay. I mean, most folks would certainly fall under one realm or the other, but either the category of student or staff member, but not everybody.
Well, or a parent could be in the building, or, just pick up and drop off, so,
Yeah.
there's a lot of.
Board members.
Board members might be in the building, yeah.
Would you state
Mrs.
other
Bradford.
adult, or no? It wouldn't need to, you would not need to add adult on the end, you could just say or other?
I think others would cover it. I mean,
Okay.
as with most of our policies, they're geared toward, in this case, we're talking about protection of students predominantly,
Okay.
but it's students or others.
Okay.
We don't want students to pose a risk to themselves or anyone else, be that
Okay.
person a student, a staff member, or anybody else who happens to be there.
Mrs. Burton, would you leave staff member in, so it would read whether the behavior poses security risk to any student, comma, staff member, comma, or other person,
I'm fine with that.
or other individual?
I'm fine with that.
I think
Mhm.
other individual might be appropriate.
That's fine.
I like
Yep.
What if it's a visiting dog?
What?
So student, staff member, or other individual.
Other individual, I like personally.
Yep, that's fine.
Other just kind of,
Leaves
for
it
me, just
hanging.
drops.
Okay. That's fine with me.
Okay, so let me capture so that I can provide this to Mrs. Wozniak. So number 5 would read, whether the behavior posed a security risk to any student, comma, staff member, or other individual, semicolon.
Yes.
Yes.
Yep. Does that work for the rest of the board?
I'm good.
Yeah.
I think so, that sounds good.
So, Mr. Archibald, the only remaining item then, as far as the legislature is concerned, that remains a zero tolerance is a firearm in a building. And that is the only item for which this board could potentially face a mandatory expulsion without consideration of any other factor.
I believe it's a dangerous weapon, which is to include a firearm,
Okay,
but that's correct.
In a weapon-free zone, so it potentially could be on a school bus or et cetera. So it may not be specifically in a school building, but in a school zone.
But you are correct. And there are still, there are exceptions which could play, which would prevent us from expelling the student, but that would be the only one that if those exceptions are not met, we would be required to expel.
okay. All right. Thank you. Are there questions or comments from the board or the superintendent?
All set.
Mrs. Bradford?
I don't know, hold on a second. On this number 1, prohibited acts, when it says, do you see that on the first page under A? Number 4, it says firing, displaying, possessing, or threatening use of firearms, explosives, or other weapons. And then it just says penalty ranging from warning to expulsion. Doesn't that fall under zero tolerance?
Again, there are exceptions, and that just falls under the disruption of a school. Oftentimes, when if a student has a firearm or a weapon in school, they have violated multiple offenses.
Okay.
In that instance, it would be possession of a weapon or dangerous instrument, disruption of school, criminal acts, and so it is all.
It has to be included in this, but it could also include zero tolerance. Okay,
We're still bound by the law.
okay. Thank you.
Good catch.
Yeah, well, I just was looking at that thinking.
Yeah, these things show up in multiple places. Other questions or comments? Seeing none, this also is at a first reading right now, so this will go to a second reading at our next general or voting meeting, at which time we will vote on this policy and the revisions of it.
We'll provide a clean copy in your packet on Thursday.
Okay.
That brings us to the end of our special meeting agenda this evening. We are now adjourned from our special meeting. We will take about a 5 to 10 minute break, at which point we can congratulate our new principal. And after our 5 to 10 minute break, we will continue with our committee of the whole meeting for the evening. We are now at recess. Good evening. Welcome to the continuation of our evening at Livonia Public Schools Board of Education, August 14th. We are now beginning our Committee of the Whole meeting. We do not have too many folks in our audience. For those who may be watching from home, the purpose of our Committee of the Whole meeting is to discuss items. Sometimes it's a short discussion, sometimes it can get very lengthy. But we will not be voting on any items tonight. If the board has sufficient discussion on an item and is ready to vote, we'll put that item on our agenda for a vote at our next voting meeting. So these, frankly, are some of my favorite meetings. It's when we get down to into the nitty-gritty of all of our items. But again, we will not be voting on any items this evening. First item on our agenda this evening, if you would like an agenda, you can find them on our website, which is www.livoniapublicschools.org. The first item on our agenda this evening is audience communications. I do not see anyone in our audience who looks like they want to participate in our audience communication or have any blue slips. Anybody present? Nope. All righty. We'll go on to the next item. Item 2 is Committee of the Whole. There are no items under Committee of the Whole. Mrs. Oquist, did you have anything for this?
I do not, President Burton.
All right, thank you. I will turn the meeting over. Item 3 is our Curriculum Committee, and I will turn it over to Mrs. Bradford.
Thank you, President Burton. Tonight we have 2 items on our agenda. One is the elementary report card, and the other is Operation Student Success, and both will be reported out by Mrs. Teresa O'Brien.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm excited tonight to share an update on the changes to our elementary report card for the 2017-18 school year. Our current report card was adopted in 2009 when a committee of teachers worked to align our curriculum and the report card with the state of Michigan GLICs, which were our grade level equivalents at that time. Since then, we've made some small adjustments with updates to content areas and adding comments so that parents had a stronger understanding of what was expected at each grade level. In 2010, the state of Michigan adopted a new set of standards in English language arts, listening and speaking, and mathematics. During the past year, they added the next generation science standards. And in 2015, our state assessments were aligned then with these new standards. So beginning in 2014, we've spent the past 2.5 years looking at realigning our report card and developing a new report card. We had our literacy and math leaders work together to read research, look at what other districts who had already aligned to the new standards and what they were using as a report card. It was during the initial phase of the learning that a focus was placed on a standards-based model. A standards-based model was a system of instruction, assessment, grading, and reporting that's based on students demonstrating their understanding or mastery of the knowledge and skills they're expected to learn as they progress through their education. While traditional grading systems sometimes include other factors like homework, effort, behavior. By adding these factors into our grades, it doesn't communicate what a student can and cannot do in terms of their attainment of the standards. Standards-based grading is being implemented in an effort to provide consistent, accurate, and meaningful feedback that supports student learning. The behavior, social skills, and effort will continue to be reported just under the lifelong learning area of the report card. Our literacy and math leaders, and then last year we had many teacher volunteers who piloted our report card. After the first year, we realigned our pilot to match the priority standards that we rolled out last year in the 2016-17 school year. So beginning in just about a month, we will be moving forward with replacing reading, writing, and speaking and listening, those portions of our current report card, with the priority standards for each grade level of those areas. We will add science, social studies, and special areas next year, along with the math standards, which we are going to pilot for another year because last year was our first year of using Everyday Math 4. And so we just had one full year of implementation. We want to make sure we have our assessments aligned for our mathematics. Administrators and teachers had many opportunities for professional development throughout the school year last year at principal meetings, which then they shared at building-based professional development, staff meetings, collaborative learning time. And finally, in the spring, all teachers were offered a half-day release time to prepare them for the changes that were coming this year. In about 2 weeks, we'll be kicking off with our professional development here in August, and all teachers will get another half day to set them up for success for using the new report card. Throughout the pilot, parents received a survey. So all the parents who had a pilot report card received a survey for each quarter or trimester. Last year we went to trimesters. And one of the questions that we asked them is, do they understand the standards? Because we wrote the whole standard out as it is, and our new grading key. Although we did not have very strong participation of the parents who did respond, over 85% replied that they understood both the standard and the grading key. We were to present the new report card at the final district communication team last spring, but it ended up being canceled with the transition activities. So we are already on the agenda for the first meeting of this school year. So we are looking forward to providing parents with consistent, accurate, and meaningful feedback through a standards-based report card that will share what a child knows, understands, and is able to do with their grade level standards. So do you have any questions?
Karen?
No?
No.
Oh.
You're you're in charge of this portion, huh?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Mr. Centers?
I was just curious, you said that 85% of parents understood. Was there any feedback on if they liked the format or not? I know that
Yep.
report card changes can be a little unnerving sometimes for parents.
And there was a place for comments, and we got all ranges of comments. Some people
Okay.
who said that they were very wordy, some that said, I want to know how my child is doing. So the grading key is meet standards, approaching standards, or not yet approaching standards. So one of the things that we did based on the parent feedback is we've created some drop-down areas that would better explain the standards. So we didn't want to take the standards apart and have our teachers grade them piecemeal, because they are meant to be a deep understanding of that standard. But in a particular standard like reading, where it's can identify the main ideas and details and use the text to support their thinking, so those two ideas, a teacher could select uses main ideas and details and then grade that as a substandard as an area of strength or an area of a growth goal. So they can grade the overall standard, but then also give parents some more feedback as to how they're progressing towards that standard. And then the grading key, it was well over 90% the understanding of the grading key. So we did get, and we used the parent feedback then, met with the teachers, talked about what it said, and then what we could make changes about.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? Liz?
Thank you. I just want to say that it makes sense to have the grade reports and the educational academic reports lining up with the standards, because there's a lot of confusion that happens if you say, well, this is what they're supposed to be learning, but I don't understand it, or I don't see that in their academic report. So I appreciate that change being made.
Thank you.
Mrs. O'Quist?
Oh, no, please go ahead.
Oh, Mrs. Burton?
You mentioned this, but I just wanted to make sure that parents caught it, because there was a lot of information given, that the homework, the effort, and the behavior still will be addressed, simply separately from whether or not they're meeting the standards academically. So it will be addressed, I understand, did you say in the lifelong learning section of the report card?
Right,
Okay.
so it'll still be reported to parents on those areas, but the idea with standards-based grading is that it doesn't affect whether they can or cannot meet the
Right.
standard. So
Which
yes,
are-
it'd still be reported to parents and communicated how their child is doing in those areas.
Okay, thank you.
Mrs. Frank?
In the new system, how does a parent get updated on the student's progress throughout the year as opposed to waiting on the report card? Is because if they take a test, their test, they get a 98%, they don't do percentages anymore, but it's a 3 or 4, correct? It's the number system, it's a rubric in elementary, 1, 2, 3, or 4, correct?
So in some areas, we'll be using rubrics, but we're going to try and move away from some summative. So if I'm doing a test, what we want to do is use those tests to give kids feedback on how they're doing on those standards. So there will be some type of an assessment that says you got it or you don't, but we're trying to build, both in our kids and in our staff, that what we're looking at is we want all kids to achieve these things, and so we're working towards giving them the feedback they need so they keep growing in those areas. So there are rubrics, especially like in reading and writing, but they might not have a 4, 3, or a percent.
Right.
Instead, what we're looking for is they have these pieces, we want to work on these pieces.
I think one of the pieces of that, it's not clear, I don't think, when you use the standards base, when you're using that system, when you get a test back from your child that they did whatever they did on a test, sometimes it's not always accurately reflected on the report card, because you can get tests back that have 1 or 2 wrong out of several pages, and then on the report card, instead of meet standards, it's approaching standards. So I think it's a growth. This will be a growth period for parents as well as for the students, because you look and you're thinking, why are you not yet at meeting the standards? Why are you still approaching, whenever all of the information that you've gotten back from your teachers so far is that your tests you're doing well. And so I just think, while it might be more helpful for the teachers or to be more reflective of the standards test, it's very difficult as a parent to understand, just like you said, where is my child? Where is my child? Because when you get all A's, you know where they are. If you get all B's, you know where they are. So I think that's one thing. It's just going to take some time. It's going to take, for parents, time. It's going to take teachers, maybe at curriculum night, just explaining, because my student then told me, Mom, the teacher says everyone is approaching standards because we're at the beginning of the year, so everyone's approaching standards, but still, what they taught in that first part of the year, you want your child to meet the standards as opposed to just always be approaching the standards. But it was explained to me that at the end of the year you'll meet standards, but at the beginning of the year you don't. But my understanding is this particular thing that you learned, you should meet that standard before you move on to ideally. Is that true?
So, different standards.
We're in the weeds,
So-
so we don't need to go in the weeds, but I'm just explaining.
Nope. So
Okay.
standards are end-of-year expectations. We do teach still some units, so like a unit on informational reading. So those standards are going to be taught during that unit, right? And so, but at the end of the unit, maybe they're doing a reading and writing project. So there might be multiple standards that are being assessed in that summative assessment, but the kids have been assessed along the way also. So the piece that I said, so what we took from the parents was, so your child would get approaching standard.
Yeah.
But underneath that, there would be more information, what their areas of strength are and what their growth goals are. And one of the things we want to do is begin to build in our students choosing their own goals, looking at their work and saying, I want to work on this. This is an area. And so between the two things, the teacher giving them some feedback of where they need to grow, and a student say, I want to work on this. So both of those areas. So this will be our first year. We had a lot of teachers pilot, but not all. So there's going to be some mix
Right.
to get going. But that's our goal. We have several formative assessments for teachers to use. We have some summative assessments, but one of the other things is looking then at our beginning of the year data, our iReady data, and what do my kids need? What does this group of reading students need? So learning how to build towards those things. So it is a shift. It's going to be a shift for students, for teachers, and for parents.
Right.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Well, I was going to digress into a discussion about standards. So,
Do we want to
probably
go
shouldn't.
there?
I'd love to, but I don't think we should. So you
Okay.
can talk to me after this about standards.
Sounds good. Thank you. We appreciate that. Anybody else? Oh, Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you. I wanted to mention two things. One, President Burton had mentioned, I just wanted to be sure that the board captured and the community captured that although the elements that Mrs. O'Brien had discussed that are still key to work as students with regard to effort and work completion and behavioral and, attention in the classroom, et cetera. Oftentimes, those have had an undue influence on a student's end result on their report card, on their grade. So rather than indicating whether or not the child had achieved, or young adult had achieved what was meant to be learned, right? So what do we want children to know and be able to do either by the end of a unit, by the end of a semester, by the end of a year? We want to clearly and simply communicate on that element. Now, there's other important feedback that parents would like to have with regard to effort in those other pieces that are part of a school setting and part of a child's educational profile, but it appropriately should be separate from whether or not they've attained the skills needed to meet that standard. And so that's a really important distinction. And it leads me to my second point, which is the shift in grading practices, the shift in feedback. When we talk about formative assessment, I know many of you are familiar with this, but when we talk about formative assessment, the kind of assessment that goes on a daily basis, on a regular basis throughout lessons, versus a summative assessment, which might be an end-of-unit test or end-of-semester test. So there will be shifts that will need to take place, again, for our staff, not only on marking the report card, and really the audience for the report card are our parents. They are the ones who we want to be sure understand what we're communicating to them about their child's progress. In addition to that, we want to be certain that our teachers feel comfortable with making those shifts as well. And I appreciate Mrs. O'Brien's efforts to build some of that in well before this school year started, because really you have to understand not only the standards themselves, you have to understand standards-based grading in order to get to our revised report card. And so it really is a layered but very connected set of pieces that our curriculum folks are leading throughout this process. Many of our principals, in addition to a number of teachers, our literacy leaders and math leaders, have been deeply involved in this work and are really going to be key to helping it move forward. But please continue to bring questions forward to us if you have them. This, again, it will be a shift, but more appropriately focused on what is a child able, what are they able to know and do, versus simply their compliance within a school setting.
Any other questions? And we have to remember, we're only doing, at this point, the reading, the writing, the speaking, and the listening. The mathematics, science, and social studies are still not, they're not a...
They'll come the following year.
They'll come
Right.
late, okay.
So they'll be 4, 3, 2, 1 in our traditional
Yes, they'll be the
grading
traditional
system.
grading
Yes.
system, and then it will be changing next year, or whenever we are able to.
Our hope is next
Implement.
year. Social studies standards haven't come out, but that's the only thing we're worried about. We have
Okay.
the science standards, we are, we're going to build some better assessments for math this year, so
Okay,
our hope is next year.
great. Okay, any other comments? I think that ends the elementary report card update. So we will move on to Operation Student Success, B. Mrs. O'Brien.
Thank you. I would also like to share this evening how we are using our current model of Operation Student Success to meet some of the requirements of the third grade reading bill. And so I would like to share the processes and the practices that we are going to be putting in place for all of our students to read at grade level. So the focus is kids who are below grade level, but overall it's for everyone and for all of our students where they are in reading. So this fall we will begin to shift using our Operation Student Success model to create a more systematic way to provide our students the reading support they need, and then also create a system for collecting that data throughout the year. So they will be, this will be our plan to adhere to that law, that all students by 2019-20, third graders, will be reading at grade level. And if they're not, if they're more than a grade level below, as determined by the state, and that particular piece we still don't know what that is, they can be retained. So as we have looked at all of these requirements, we have many things in place through our Operation Student Success model. And I would like to share with you some of the things we currently have in place and then some of the changes we are making in order to meet the law. So currently, our students are tested 3 times a year in reading and math using the iReady program. The law states that they must be assessed within the first 30 days of school. So we've adjusted our testing calendar really only by a week. And the state had to approve your list of assessments. iReady is one of them. We also test all of our children using the Fontes and Pinnell reading assessment, and we will continue to do that. Both of those have been approved by the state. So those pieces are already there. Then the communication of the results. So we test right away at the beginning of the year. We typically wait until parent-teacher conferences to share unless we have a concern. But the law requires that we have 30 days from the end of testing to inform a parent whether their child is at, above, or below grade level. So we will be providing parents with their child's results and a letter stating whether they're at, above, or below after we are completed with the iReady and their Fontes and Pinnell testing. So that'll be a change. We'll be moving that up.
Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay.
Is that at every K through 3 or just at the 3rd grade level that you
K
have to?
through 3 we have to do.
So every grade, K1, 2, 3, will get a letter?
With their
Within the
results.
30, okay, so within 30 days, they will take the assessment, and then post the test, they will receive a letter within 30 days stating the results of that test?
Correct.
Okay.
And
And that will only happen at the beginning of the year?
So, and then at
That's
the end, we'll give them more information.
Okay.
So as a result of them getting their test results, if they've been identified as below grade level, we need to create an individualized reading plan. So that's determined by the state. So we have organized our testing schedule so that once those letters go out, when the parents come to parent-teacher conferences, we now have those in October, because we're on trimester, so we don't have them with the report card. Their first report card goes home in December. We have parent-teacher conferences in October, so then those parents would be able to come and meet with their child's teacher in mid-October to create that individualized reading plan for their student. So we've got it organized so that we can hit the ground pretty quick after our assessments are done. And so then the parent will meet with the child's teacher, they'll create a plan of how they're going to help fill the holes or help bridge the gap between the grade level and where the child is reading. And then the next piece is that all children are going to get reading interventions based on that data. So currently, all students get small group instruction. So all students get whole group instruction on grade level standards, and then they get small group instruction on their individual needs. It could be on their reading level, it could be around a skill that they're working on in reading. As a part of the law, they need to have it 5 days a week. So if they're below grade level, they need to have an intervention 5 days a week. And as they get older, if they continue to be below grade level, that amount of time in intervention needs to increase. So this first year, we'll lay some baseline data as to the amount of time that students are missing. But I want to remind you that our quality core instruction, and we also call that our tier 1 instruction, that's what all students get. So all students get reading instruction at their level and then on their grade level standards. Whether they're a little below or a little above, they still need to read second grade, be assessed on the second grade reading standards. So then a major portion of Operation Student Success has been for us building in our classroom teachers that they can provide the interventions at the table, their small group reading table. So one of the nice things iReady has given us is some specific skill areas. So if I knew that my students needed to be reading at a level M and they were reading at a level J, so I'd be practicing with them at level J, iReady gives us a little bit more information as to some skills that can move them from J to K, from K to L. So those and then teachers can work with their groups on those skills at the small group area. In addition to, we have our elementary support teachers, Title I teachers, some additional staffing who can also help with doing those interventions. And then the last piece is really the documentation piece. So as a part of Operation Student Success, teachers do keep track of what they work on with their kids. So what we're going to do is just take that and make it systemic for all buildings so it looks the same. That will give us then data that we can look at and compare. So if Mrs. Bradford's working on this with her students, and then I can compare it to what might be happening with another classroom down the hall. And that way buildings can look at that data, and then we can look at it district-wide. What interventions are we gathering the information on? One of the other pieces that we are putting in place is we're going to create a schedule that has an intervention block for each grade level so that teachers have a set-aside time to do reading interventions. So they might be working at their table and students doing independent reading, and then they choose, could have another group come up. So each school is going to designate a time so that there's no interruptions. So if I'm a second grade teacher, none of the teachers have a special at that time. Everybody is doing reading at that time, and it helps make the support staff be able to come in at that time and not interrupt any new learning that's going on in that classroom. So although we have 3 years before any of our students would be required by the state to be retained, this is going to provide us with the time to create the systematic way of assessing, then communicating with our parents, and then providing the interventions. So these next couple of years, we can begin to collect this data and look at what is working. And then, based on those successes, help support each other as we work with our struggling learners. An additional piece that we'll be starting will be the job-embedded professional development that they're going to get with working with a literacy coach. So literacy coaches will come in and work with a classroom teacher looking at their own classroom data. So they'll sit down with them and say, who do you want to work on? What area do you want? And then help coach them as to how to close that gap with those students or meet the needs of those students, whether they're at or just how to improve their reading looking at the data. So ultimately in 2019-20, we know that our third graders would be retained if they're not at the proficiency level determined by the state, which at this point we still don't know. But we do have good cause exemptions. So there are areas that, although this law is quite rigid, there are areas that will give us the opportunity to look at individual students' needs and say what's right for them. And we have many pieces in place, so I'm looking forward to continuing to share with you our growth as we use this model and what our student data shows as we continue on using it. Questions?
Liz?
Thank you. Firstly, it doesn't have to be spelled out in the sky, that the connection between the way this program is developed and the standards-based learning that we discussed for the report cards. I love seeing that consistency, and that's going to make it easier at home and at school, so kudos to you for that. You did mention about having the parent-teacher conferences as an opportunity to meet with parents and discuss progress prior to a report card. What will happen if a parent is not able to make parent-teacher conferences? And the second part of the question is, will we have enough time set aside for conferences to accommodate meeting with so many people for what's bound to be a more extended period of time?
So we always have put into place calling parents who don't come to parent-teacher conference, trying to set up another conference time, at the minimum having one on the phone. The law does have, again, some explicit rules of parent contact about their child's reading. So we will double our efforts to make sure that we touch base with each and every one of our parents. Tell me your second part of your question.
About having enough time to accommodate those conferences.
So one of our goals is, since the parent will already have the data, we're going to have looked at the data and have looked at what iReady or their Fontes and Pinnell level says, and kind of have a skeletal plan, because time will be a factor if I have 25 students in my class. And so that then we can have that conversation with parents, but have some pre-planned things so that we say, this is where we look, this is what we're going to work on to start. And then have a model for continuing to communicate with the parents as to how their child is doing in those areas.
I'm going to just build on that. Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien. Oftentimes, and this really prior to this legislation requiring it, if we had a student with whom we needed more time, it may not be unusual for a teacher and the EST or the teacher and the principal to schedule a double block of conferences. And so oftentimes if we're below the grade level cap, and really we will be across the board, some classes more than others, then you can often take some of those students with whom you need that additional time and bank it in right then and there. Oftentimes it may require a follow-up, and there is a pretty extensive read-at-home connection piece that's required of us to not only bring parents in, but also to be providing those resources home. And so there'll really be an effort on both ends. But oftentimes those are booked in advance so that we have a little bit of that time built in, because those minutes go quickly, as you know.
I guess that was my same concern. If you're in a classroom with a lot of readers that need additional attention, the time the teacher has in order to implement her plan, in fact, the individual reading plan, I think it's a great idea. It's just I'm nervous to see how it will work out in the classroom, as far as if you've got a class of 25 to 27 kids and you have 10 of them that need IRPs or individual reading plans, how that's going to look and how a teacher will be able to give the time necessary to those students to really get it going. And my other concern was the same thing. Meeting with parents, or making sure that the parents are aware, fully aware. I guess with the letter going home, they will know exactly where their student stands in their reading portion. And I'm just nervous about the parents and how they will, if their child isn't making the progress that they want to be made, how much of that will be on the teacher? How much I just feel the teachers are going to have a lot on their plate as far as trying to get these readers going. And we have wonderful teachers, and they work really hard in the classroom. And a lot of that piece involves parents. A big portion of it is driven for home reading, necessitates reading at home, and that component. And that makes me nervous about that component at home. Are those students going home, and are they working on those skills that they need to work on? Because a teacher can only do so much in a classroom, and our teachers work really, really hard to try to meet those goals with those kids. But if you have so many students that need that extra assessment, how will that look in the classroom? So I think it's a great plan, but I hope it can be, it's going to take a lot of work.
It is. The good news is, and Mrs. O'Brien, I believe, started with this and gave us a really comprehensive overview of how the work that we have been doing in Operation Student Success over the past 4 years has really laid the groundwork for this. So although some of the documentation of this and communication to parents will be an added element, and that will certainly be something with which we'll be looking to support our teachers with that. The idea of intervening and providing support wherever students are on the continuum. So we expect growth out of our highest readers. We don't just want growth for our struggling readers. We want growth for our students who are reading at grade level, above grade level. It really, our mantra of every child, every classroom, every teacher, every day does not just mean the students who are struggling. It means everyone. I think one of the things that we're really excited about, in addition to the literacy coach support, are some of the additional supports that the board has approved with regard to some of the additional EST and et cetera. And remember, we did that based on equity and based on
Right.
need.
The need.
And so as we took a look at the needs that exist, in the places where we could, we have put in some of those additional supports, and we believe that those folks will be very important in helping with meeting the tenets of some of those individual reading plans for our Tier 2 and Tier 3 students who need those additional supports. And then, in addition to that, we're also utilizing some of our 31A funds at all of our schools to provide time in the day of our resource room teacher and our speech and language teacher to provide a minimum of 10% of their week can be used on supporting our readers who do not have special education services. And so when we're talking about the ESTs, the resource room teachers, or the teachers of speech and language, these are some of the teachers who have the most experience in meeting the needs of those students. What that does is that allows the teacher to not only provide intervention for those students, but be able to support all of the
Everybody
learners
else.
in the classroom. And so really, the pieces between the 31A funds and the additional Wayne County Enhancement Millage funds, we believe are going to provide some additional support in the places that need it the most. So we've took into account, as levels of poverty and free and reduced lunch, English language learner numbers, the size of the school, et cetera, as we put into place those additional supports. That's a really important piece that we need to continue to monitor, just like the question on conferences and is that going to be the right time to go over the individual reading plan, or are we going to need time in addition to that? Those will be all of the things we'll be able to work through this first year of implementation of these guidelines from the state. But the good news is that the bones of this have really, the structure has been in place for quite some time, and I think that will aid our teachers in putting in these next steps.
No doubt, starting now is going to be a real positive piece, I
Yeah.
think, by the time you get these third graders. It's just making sure that the parents understand along this continuum from kindergarten, first, second, that they're aware that, look, your child is at risk, or, this is, and we are doing everything we can to get that child up to that spot, but it's going to take a lot of work, I think. I think it's great that the plan's in place. And I know it's just going to be, it'll be hopefully successful, I'm hoping. Liz?
Thank you. Just out of curiosity, in the past, we've had some community help. We've had grandparents coming into schools. We've had some of our retired staff coming in to help readers, struggling readers, and particularly readers who don't have the opportunities at home to read. Is that something we're still going to be able to do or even to increase?
Any school that, the volunteers that each school gets, they use them, number
Utilize
one, to read with students. Practice math and read with students. So any school that has the opportunity to increase the amount of parent volunteers or community volunteers, they certainly are always looking for ways for students to buddy up to an adult and practice.
And you don't have to have a child in the school to do that.
Nope.
Fantastic. Everyone's listening, right?
Yes, exactly. Dan?
So I think this is probably the best plan we could have with the resources we have. I think it's still going to be very challenging for classroom teachers. And when the state went ahead and passed this legislation, did it come with a dump truck full of money with it? So we're using money that from our Wayne County Enhancement Millage, which we're very fortunate to have, which that we have some money in our at-risk fund. We are very fortunate to have that. However, this is a far cry from services that Livonia Public Schools was able to offer at times of plenty, things like reading recovery, more level literacy groups, things like that. So this is going to be really challenging, I think, for our teaching staff. And I know they're going to work hard and they're going to do a really great job. But I want people to know that we're still struggling. We still need resources, and we could do more if we were in a different position. And I know this is going to probably be an improvement, and people are going to work really hard at it. But I still feel a little frustrated because I know we can do more for kids if we have a little bit more resources.
I agree. Mrs. Burton?
We've had a lot of discussion about the struggling learners, and I've got a couple questions that are geared more toward the learners who are excelling beyond their grade level to make sure that, just to find out from you what the plans are to make sure that they continue to excel at whatever rate they can. You said all students are receiving instruction 5 days a week, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then our struggling learners are receiving additional interventions beyond that, and those interventions also take place 5 days a week.
Correct.
Do I understand that correctly?
Under the law, yes. If
Okay.
they're below grade level, they need to have interventions 5 days a week. Every reading block in the elementary is whole group instruction, so the teacher meets and shares the strategy or the skill of the day. Then there's usually a practice time where students then go and use that skill in reading books at their level. So whether they're above grade level, at, or below, they're going off and practicing main idea, how to understand what the main idea of the story is. During the time that students are practicing, teachers pull students up to their table. And so they try to work with all of their students, but they don't meet with every group every day. Our struggling learners by law will need to be met with every day. But our grade level students meet with their teacher multiple times each week. Our students above meet. So we have, teachers already have several things in place that they do. And like Mrs. Oquist said, we have a lot of these things in place already of what to do with our struggling learners. We're going to take what we're doing in our buildings and make it systematic. So our reading block is 120 minutes for reading and writing workshop. So that's a long time. Some teachers break it up into smaller groups, but the expectation is that students spend time practicing reading, and that's the time then the teacher can pull other students up to the table. So they have some are reading, and then they rotate through, whether they do a center type of a classroom. There's a program called Daily 5 where students read with the teacher, they read with a partner, they read to themselves. So different ways of practicing reading. So during that time, they're doing those different things.
So our students who are at grade level or who are excelling are receiving that whole group reading instruction every single day and still practicing that every single day.
Correct.
Okay.
So the grade level standards are expected, the achievement of the grade level standards is expected for all students.
And that leads me to my next question. Okay, so the students are going to be tested on their grade level expectations. So say we have a second grader who's actually reading at a fourth grade level. Would I be correct in assuming they're going to be tested at a second grade level to make sure they actually have all those second grade concepts down pat?
Correct.
And we didn't accidentally jump over some because their reading level is rather advanced. But they will be tested at their appropriate, at the grade level at which they are.
Correct.
Physically in that grade. Will they then also be tested at the grade level that is matching their ability at that point?
So
And how are we going to assess where this second grader who reads at a fourth grade level, where that child actually is
Right.
reading?
So we have a variety of levels of assessment. So their reading level, what I can read independently or instructionally with some guidance for the teacher, when that's above grade level, then I'm spending that practice time in those types of books. The grade level standards that's expected of everyone, they're very deep. The expectation is that they are year-end standards. It is my expectation that there will be very few kids who meet the standard at the beginning of the year because of the complexity, the depth of knowledge that we want students. We just don't want recall. We want them to analyze the text that they're doing, to write something about what they read. And so even students who can read above grade level will be working on then how to do those skills with grade level text. And then the next level would be, if they can do it with second grade level text independently, let's work on where they're reading independently on their own. If they're reading at a higher level on their, leveled readers, can they take another book that they're interested in and apply those same standards?
So that
So
kind of goes
let
back
me
to
build on to the assessment piece that,
Right. Go
that
ahead.
you asked about. So the two assessments that are commonly used, the Fontes and Pinnell assessment, is based on their reading level. So within a second grade classroom, you may have a student assessed at the kindergarten level, and that's where the assessment would take place all the way up through fourth or fifth grade. And so that is meant to assess at their grade level.
Okay.
And determine where they are. And then there's a range within a grade level of usually about four letter levels that are within that band for that grade. And then there are shaded areas that parents can see when they're reading above grade level, at grade level, et cetera. The iReady assessment will also adjust based on the skill level of the student. And so where they may start at one particular level, if they excel, then that will, I don't want to say self-correct, but that will adjust based on that student's ability and may go far beyond that grade level for that student's assessment. And so those two are just examples of assessments that the student may be assessed at their grade level, but more importantly, they're assessed at their ability level.
Right, and that's
So-
exactly what I was concerned about.
Yes.
Exactly. I mean, I understand the importance of both. We need to make sure that the student truly is learning everything that's in that, they're given grade level content. But I also want to assess where they are, even if that's a grade or two above that.
Sure.
So you're saying that through Fontes and Pinella and iReady, we're going to get the picture of where they are, even if it is shooting a couple levels above. And with the report card coming out, we're also going to see how they're meeting their physical grade level. So we're going to have an assessment of both pieces for children who are at or excelling beyond their grade level.
Depth and breadth.
Okay, thank
Yep.
you. That's what I needed to know. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Mrs. Bonnefield?
Over the years with having kids that have needed some extra help, I have found the reaction that I get from a lot of the interventionists from our willingness to work with them and be accepting of the fact that our kids had some issues that we needed to deal with, is that are there any supports in place or training for the teachers? And believe me, I agree with all of this that's happening, but I worry about the teachers because I've seen over the years so many parents that either are angry if they're told that their child isn't meeting the standards, and the same thing, I have the same thing, the concern with the conferences and stuff. I mean, it just, there's never enough time, in the 3 minutes or the 10 minutes that they get at the conferences, it just, right now, just going and talking about your child takes up all that time and more, and then now we have a reading plan, and we have to talk about the standards report cards, and I worry about the teachers, I don't know, the emotional drain that this is going to take on them. And maybe I'm awfulizing about it. Like I said, I agree with everything that we're doing, but I feel for the teachers who are I feel like they're just going to be emotionally bombarded because it's a new thing. Maybe in 3 to 5 years when we've moved to this model and it's the expectation, but this is so far removed from my generation, many of our generations of A, B, C, D. My kids got all A's, they're great kids, they know everything, what's to worry about, or the kids that are C's and the kids are just told that they're average. Do you know where I'm going with that? I just think this is a lot for the teachers and is really going to be impactful on them and just their emotional well-being and if there's some supports for them, because this is going to be, they're being asked to interact with parents and parents should be interacting. And again, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be and that this should be a huge change. I think the conversation is going to be different, and the conversation is going to be a lot more difficult to have. And as parents, we're going to have to accept the fact that, we're really digging down into what we're teaching our kids. And just passing the test isn't enough anymore. You know, it is meeting those standards, and it is, maybe you have a kid that's reading at high school or, you know, novels or whatever, but yet they can't meet the second grade standards. And maybe that's a little bit too much of a differentiation, but, you know, there's certain reading skills that you need to have, and just because you can read a high school textbook doesn't necessarily mean that you meet all the standards, which include being able to utilize the text and stuff. It's not just about reading those words. So I'm sorry, I'm going on, but I'm not sure how
I agree
to-
with what, I'm just saying, there's a lot at stake here, only because with this third grade reading bill, I mean, what are we doing to our children? This is my concern. You know, by third grade, if they don't pass this assessment, which we don't know what the assessment is,
Right.
there's a lot at stake. I mean, we're
Yeah.
talking
Oh,
a year's
huge.
worth of remodification. I mean, we're
Yeah.
talking about holding a child back for a whole nother year,
Yeah.
and I guess I know what your point is. The teacher is going to be under a lot of duress if she's got several students that are under that below reading level, and she's working on getting them there, and just the pressure to make sure that this student, we all want these students to succeed, every single student, but these kids that are going to be below grade level by third grade, I think there's such a lot at stake there emotionally, and physically holding a child back. I just have a lot of concerns with that. That being said, I think the plan that we're going in is wonderful, and I agree. I think we all agree on that. It's just, I think it's extremely challenging, as Dan says. This is going to be interesting to see in the next 3 years how this looks in the big picture, and how a parent understands where their child sits by the end of third grade, because if they're not passing that test, there's that whole other component now that we're going to have to look at. What do we do? How do we keep these kids back and keep them emotionally stable and well? Because I just think it's terrible, to be honest. I mean, I don't think it's a right thing to do at all, but this is this is the card we're dealt. This is what we have to deal with. And on that note, I think we're doing a great job. We are preparing as best we can for this, but I just see it as being a huge challenge. And like Dan said, financially, it's a travesty, because there are going to be kids that are going to be held back, no doubt. And I can't imagine how that's going to look in 3 years when a teacher has to sit with a parent and say, I'm sorry, little Billy did not pass this statewide assessment. He's going to be staying back. I don't understand how that's going to look. I guess that's my comment. Crystal.
I just wanted to offer a different perspective as well, coming from a parent. I truly believe in education. There should be no surprises. When you go to your parent-teacher conference, you should know what you're going to hear from the teacher. So that should not be a first conversation of somebody who is greatly at risk, or the third grade, that they don't know when they got to third grade that their child is significantly below grade level. One of my children had a phenomenal teacher who did a standards base on each test. There was a standards base, so I knew I could look at that. And I knew on the because as a parent, when you look at a test, I don't really know what standards match up. But she did a standards grid on each test, so I knew exactly what meets standards is approaching standards. So I knew, so that was never a surprise to me when I got the report card. And I think if the teachers are proactive that way in communicating with the parents where their child is, that this is not going to be a huge surprise to them when they either, one, get the report card, if the teacher has been communicating all along, here's what the standards are, this is the test, this is what it does with comparing to the standards, because parents of our generation don't know what it is unless it's an A, B, C, or D. But if the teachers are communicating effectively throughout the school year from day one, from 30 days in, this is where your student is, I don't think it's going to be as emotionally charged at that first meeting, or when the parents get that report card of, what do you mean my child is below standards, because they've known about it all along. And so I think that that's a piece that that teachers can proactively do to train the parents and train the students on this is where you are and this is where we're going to go, so that it's not this huge shock they got into third grade and they're realizing how far below standards they are because they've seen this pattern from the beginning of the school year.
Dan?
I agree with that. Along the same lines, though, you look at some of this M-STEP in particular, and you see statewide 35% of students are passing, or 40%. And even really exceptional student districts, maybe you see 55%. If there's an assessment like that, and we don't know what it's going to look like now, but an assessment like that could be very troublesome, kind of going along with what Karen said, where maybe, it'll be very interesting to see how they assess that. But I am concerned that our state has not done a great job of, building assessments and aligning them so that districts and students are achieving the desired results. Yeah.
Liz?
Thanks. Jumping on what both Crystal and Dan have said, it's going to be tough. It's a lot of change. And I think one thing that we haven't really talked about is that so many of our teachers do not teach standard-based education. They teach task-oriented or grade-oriented, but standard orientation is going to be a culture shift. And I'm hoping that we have an opportunity to teach our teachers how to be a standards-based educator.
They've had professional development all throughout last year. So when we rolled out the priority standards, that's been a focus. And then we ramped up that professional development since January. So you are correct. Some people, that's going to be a new piece to this. But we've been working on the depth of what those standards say. So like Mrs. Oquist said, it's a new shift in collecting the evidence of what a child can do with a standard instead of grading in the old way. I can tell you that the teachers who have been piloting have said that it is work and they know their students better than they've ever known them before by doing this. So these are good things. They're hard things.
Agree with it.
We need to make sure we take care of our teachers. That's utmost. They're the number one person in that classroom. So we need to make sure whatever we can do to support them is, how can we continue to help them with this? But that we do have some really great things that will be good tools for them to delve deep into what a student knows and is able to do.
I would just support what you're saying. As a parent, my son had some teachers last year who told me at the beginning of the year that they were part of the standards-based model, and they were kind of new at it, but that's what they were going to do. And those were the best educational experiences that my son had in his academic career. And he learned more in those classes and was able to build and grow and build on existing knowledge, and I could go on and on. It's a huge shift, but it's such a worthwhile shift.
Okay, I think that concludes us. That was a good discussion, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien.
Thank you.
The next item on our agenda is item 4, Building and Site Committee, and I'll turn the meeting over to Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, President Burton. We have 4 items tonight that Mr. Francis is going to help us with. And if he can just do a little song and dance until he gets the video up. The first will be our renovation update. Then we will discuss sale of property, then lease for Little Tots, and playground update.
And this is
Okay.
So seeing cannot operates now what I wanted.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I was hitting the wrong button.
We know you can.
He had it up and going before. There it goes. Quick, before it goes away.
There we go. Good job.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Wanted to run through some of the updated photos from the renovation projects, construction, as well as paving projects. We did this 2 weeks ago, it's been now, right? So we went through some photos. They've changed, so I updated the photos. And literally, all of these were taken Wednesday or Thursday of last week, and I probably could have gone out a half an hour ago and it would have changed again. So, ever-moving target, as you know, we're getting down to the home stretch. It's August, it's mid-August, so things are happening quickly. But I thought I'd take a few minutes and just sort of roll you through what we do have. It's kind of fun to see and to think about where we started and where we're getting to. So, I'm going to start off at Churchill High School. You can see this is a fun just construction picture of the front with some of the items and dirt piles going on. But got a little closer. They were working on the secure vestibule at Churchill. You can see the formation of it, that it's going to encompass around the posts there. And then that shot on the left was out of one of the existing side doors. So that you can see them on the right picture to the left. Those are the doors I took that shot of. So they'll come straight through the plywood up next to the opening there by the brick is where you would end up coming in. So it's getting fun, yes.
Is the vestibule, it doesn't look like it's going to be used this year.
No.
It is?
Yeah, well, wait till you see the office. You won't think that'll be used either, but.
Amazing how they do.
This thing's almost done compared to the office. No, they're moving along quickly. Literally, when the walls went up, it was just such a difference. So actually, we'll get there.
Oh, look at that.
Took a whole bunch of pictures of the main office. Again, it's a shell right now, but all of the infrastructure is what takes that time. It's when they open up those walls and find potentially things they didn't know were there, and fixing those, moving some structure, and now once we start getting to this point, you can see from these photos and both of them that it's time for drywall, and frankly, it's already up. Yeah, so it's kind of fun to take a look at. You can just see, where they're at, the metal studs, and some spots, like I said, where you could see before there was some in this one behind here. To the left, some of the insulation in there. So they're moving right along. The ceiling's still open, but they'll get it all squared away and then pop the tiles back in. Without question, it'll be coming up to the last minute. Just to give you a heads up, I should have started this. We have weekly meetings with the bond team, as you're well aware, on Tuesday afternoons. So last week, when we had our meeting, Aqua was saying that there were no places that they had large concerns. As you know, they do this each year. There was nothing outstanding at that time. Now, it's been almost a week. We have our meeting tomorrow. We'll meet again and get more updates. But there was nothing that was quote unquote scaring them with regard to, there's going to be, items, especially with Churchill being a two-phase project, there's going to be items that it's going to be construction, and there might be a window that didn't come in yet, so they'll fill it and then replace it when it comes in. That's something that occurs, each August, September. So the auditorium, you can see on the left the cleared out auditorium, and to the right that's the hallway right outside of it at Churchill, with the ceiling grids removed and moving right along. Looking at the auditorium is pretty neat to take a peek in. And having been to Churchill so many times as all of us have, you take a look in now and think, wow, that's not what I remember it looking like. Whereas new structure completely never was there. This one's going to be interesting because it's going to be a renovation.
I'm assuming the bright spot on the ceiling is the sun?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The cafeteria is coming along very nicely, and there's a shot from the inside on the left, from behind the the serving counter going out, and the shot on the right is that main hallway. Yep, exactly. I personally like the black and red jacket. I think it looks really cool. So on the left, this is actually the two restrooms right outside of the cafeteria there. And one of them on the right, obviously, was further along, and the gentleman who jumped out of the way when I took the picture, they realized I was taking a photo. We're actually working on the tile in the other one. So it was a nice contrast to show. But I really like that black and red checkered pattern. And the flooring looks very nice too. Speaking of the checker pattern, that's one of the items that they're doing on the floors. So you can see, I mean, it's a smaller room on the left, so it's a little tighter, but around the perimeter on the right of the larger room, they've got the red and black check pattern going on the floors. You have the new VCT in the flooring, new drywall up. It's kind of sharp looking when you're in there. The tennis courts, as you're well aware, we were redoing outside. I apologize that it just looks like a parking lot, but it's going to be tennis courts. They're working there. This was taken last Wednesday, and you can see the majority, if you think of the tennis courts at Churchill, there's a block of 7. That's what you see on the right, and then the other smaller block of 2. So it's coming along quite well. Over at Franklin, we did some paving this summer. You can see the portions, and interestingly enough, how it fades into the, when you see them against something that's only a year old, it's interesting to see the difference. But you can see some paving out by the stadium, by the field, and out by the annex building. They did a little bit of paving over there, and next summer, we're gonna do a little bit more. The bus loop we'll be bringing up for the summer of 18. Stevenson, there's the outside of the pack. It looks really neat. It obviously very similar to Franklin, except just due to the grading over at Stevenson, it gives it that higher stance, and the stairs. That truck unfortunately was in the way, but you can see behind that truck on the left where the steps will go. It's a pretty neat sight from the outside with the blue exterior mimicking the curtain. Yes.
Mr. Francis, what is planned landscaping-wise on that berm as we see it right now, to the left and right of the stairs?
I'd have to look at the drawing, but okay. I'm sure there's going to be grass on either side, but I'd have to confirm that by looking at the drawing.
Thank you.
Sure.
With the entrance and the stairs, is there an entrance that's handicap accessible?
Yes, if you cut around to the right side, it slopes up.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Just taking a quick note for you.
Thank you.
Inside, we actually fortunate enough to the seats have just been put in. Yeah, so I got in there and got a shot with the seats in. So the ones that you saw at our previous meeting, it was empty. So looking very much like an auditorium now. Outside the pack, we can see some of the work that's going on. The shot to the left is, I believe, something you did see, but I snuck just far enough until he started yelling at me into where he was actually tiling at the time. So he said, "You're good right there. Don't move any further." And some music and band storage at Stevenson, you can see for the instruments on the left and some of the larger items on the right. 2 different rooms those are actually. And I think the dressing room on the left was looking really good. Very, very good. There's 2 of them. I just took a shot of one because they're very similar. And we also had 2 acoustical practice rooms, so I took a shot of one. You can see in the gray wall the sound paneling, and then to the left it was an accent wall. Yeah. And then to the right it was there's another acoustical wall, but windows out to the front. Very, very nice looking, very nice looking. The industrial tech room on the left, very large room. You can see the VCT flooring, and around the perimeter, the lighter blue tile. The lights are in, the ceiling's in. This one's nearing completion. It's a very large room.
It's the old auditorium.
Yes,
part of it.
By the way, that's
portion of the
when
old
you walk
auditorium
into the
on
front
the left.
doors
Okay.
and make a left. This is what you'll see, and it has 2 entrance doors because it's so large. So it is a very large room, and I know
Portion
that
of it, yeah.
Stevenson is planning at times to potentially use it for other other things. Exactly, because it has such a space. I threw the wood shop in there not because it's anything visually that you're seeing, except the floors were just redone, and when I was there, they looked very good. And I took it, and then I noticed that it's sort of shadowy. You don't quite get the same effect as being there in person, but I took a picture of it nonetheless. And the parking lot, as we've discussed, we had a reconfiguration in the front. I made sure I didn't walk all the way into 6 Mile to take a picture.
Clearly.
Next.
Yeah. But it actually is looking very good. Mrs. Oquist and myself actually drove through it last week and just sort of, okay, if we were dropping someone off, where do we go? And we did that whole thing and out and looping back around. You can see, if you move in the left picture, the right side, when you go right of the island, you can see that it is quite wide, where folks that will be, parents that will be coming through their loop and exiting, it is a wide span of probably easily fitting 3 cars, even though it's not what it's supposed to be. But to get to the right, you then have 2 opportunities to get to the left to do your Michigan left. If you missed the first one for some reason, you can go to the end and loop around the second island, or just keep going and park where the students park and go
And
on
just
in
sit
and
in there
hang
for a
out in the
while.
cafeteria for a while.
Right.
No, it's a nice loop. It's a nice loop.
The signage, I think, is really going to help. We've been there really every week throughout the summer. I've been there we've been there on weekend times just to see how some of the traffic flows for students and parents who are there for athletics and other purposes. I will say the most recent addition of the arrows and the patterning on the ground, and then some of the
We're gonna have
signs.
actual signs coming into.
Has already begun to help. And then certainly it will be a process of learning those new patterns. But I will say the addition of that has helped just in the past week or so considerably, decision-making that people make as they enter and leave the lot.
Next, go to the next one.
Frost looks beautiful. I love the color, and this isn't even doing it justice. The navy with the gray stripe is really eye-popping. The navy, it works very well. It was all white wall. This breaks it up tremendously. And that 8-inch tile going vertically at the fountains, it looks very sharp.
What is their mascot?
They are now the Falcons.
Falcons.
They were the
Frost Falcons.
Phantoms with a horse head that changed a few years back. The students voted, and they're now the Falcons.
Okay, with and then navy and gray is the.
So the color pattern is no longer the red and black. It's, I don't want to say that it's officially navy and gray, but I know that it used to be a lot of red and black in that building, and they're working on removing some of the signage. I talked to the principal, Mr. Vate, and he's looking at even changing some of the signage. He really likes this color palette, and he wants it to come together.
It's nice.
It is. It's really beautiful when you go in. What you see here is the counseling office. So on the left, that's the main hall. They used to be wide open.
Right.
We've enclosed that with the door, and then on the inside, this used to be 2 offices. We've opened it up, and it'll be one larger area. You can see that the carpeting is already down, so they just need to clean up the edges, and there's going to be the secretary and room for students in there, et cetera. And then there's actual counseling offices behind that plastic curtain. The industrial tech room, the cubicles were removed. It was cleaned up. Talking to the principal and assistant principal, they are just excited is a great word. They were in there talking about all the possibilities. Of course, they do the drafting class in here still, but I know that they foresee this as a space, because that's a couple hours a day. They foresee it as a space that they'll be able to use for students now and even moving forward into the future. So it's very nice looking.
Love that carpeting.
Yeah, the carpet came out very nice. I
I had
happened
the
to take.
opposite reaction. I'm like, I cannot believe you covered up those wood floors.
Yeah, and we were I was to the left. That picture a couple weeks back, I took it, and next time I went in, it had been carpeted, so I just went back to the same spot, and it's a nice play against each other. But yeah, I do like hardwood floors.
I was going to say that would have looked nice.
This is actually something that is subtle. If you weren't knowing and looking for it going into the cafeteria, before those clouds were white on the sides, and you can see from this close-up on the right, they've given it a blue accent, so it gives it some depth and dimension, whereas in the past, if you went into the cafeteria, I mean, it was all very clean and nice, but the depth that occurred with the clouds hanging was lost. With simply going in and painting around the sides, your eye catches it, and you can see just from that picture on the left, the depth that occurs.
And that's some of the things we learned, for instance, at Riley, when we did the clouds and then did the trim color around there, and then that popped. So these are some of those pieces that we've been talking to you about, that we wanted to get back to Cooper and Frost and and do some of the things we were able to add in year 2 and year 3. And really, it's
Makes
a
it-
remarkable,
It's a lot of it's just
remarkable
paint,
boost.
and it makes
A
such a big difference. Speaking of paint, the doors are now painted the same naval. It's actually, that's the name of it. It was a Sherwin-Williams naval, but that navy blue. These were brown, so it didn't quite go with the black and then the grays and the blues. So it was sort of a chocolatey brown, which if you put it with the right other colors, it would suit very well. But with the changes with the tiles and those wall stripes, to the right is some walk-off carpet. Makes a very big difference, as we've discussed before, when students come in and get an opportunity to knock off the snow and salt from their boots. The community room, which many of us used last year one evening, it again, simply doing an accent, a little bit of paint on all 4 sides, breaks up the white from the wall to the ceiling, and it just sort of gives it a real nice look, a little pop. Gives it that. Over at Holmes, we know we did the big water main project, so we have the water main done, and as I reported back a couple weeks ago, they had just done the test that Monday morning, the pressure test, it works. I was talking to the principal, Mr. Stromberg, today, said, water's back on, things are looking good. So we just wanted to show a couple pictures of where you can see they've dug on the right and where they've dug and flattened it back out on the left. And then, of course, the paving, and it's looking very good. Something about fresh asphalt and seeing it, it's just nice and smooth and clean, so. You can see this, the front loop. Over at Cooper, again, similar with Frost, just some color being laid out in areas. For example, to the far left, you can see they have a different shade of blue and gray than Frost did, but it really, you walk in and you can see on that long strip of white wall, having those stripes breaks it up. And then in the other 2 areas, you can see some floor tile that we took some VCT and had it interspersed in. More often than not, as you can see from the left and the right, it's a square that's been put in the center. But right at the main entrance, you see more of like a ladder look. We did a little bit longer to set it off right at the main entrance. It's sharp. It gives it a nice color. Walk-off carpet to the left over at Cooper as well, and their drinking fountains are gorgeous. There was a 10-inch tile that was available in their bluish gray coloring, and it plays very well with the blues and grays of the stripe as well as the tiles on the floor. And then the main office, we talked a little bit about how the reconfiguration, what you're looking at on the left is when you come into the main office where the secretaries will be seated, that door opening will go to the back where there's a workroom, the mailboxes for the teachers, and the clinic. And what you're seeing, again on the left, is a window into the clinic so that the adults in the main office can keep an eye on any student that happens to be in there. And on the right picture, that is the actual clinic. So to the left, that cubby to the left, it's a little more than a cubby, that's where the mailboxes will be, and the door and the walled-off area is their new clinic. And then out, if this was three-dimensional, out where I am, the new multifunction, it's not the office, it's actually a work area. There's going to be some casework there. That's where they've always had their multifunction printer, so the new printer copier is there. And then we've got the walk-off carpet at Cooper with a sort of like before prepping it and then after with it down, so it looks nice. Staff lounge is being worked on. You see the internet and tech closet being walled off, and it's actually at this point, just after I took this picture, it got drywalled. It's just something that was sitting out previously in the staff lounge, and now it's going to be just a closet. And you can see the differences in the walls. It's actually been painted since these pictures were taken late last week. We saw it painted, it's fresh paint everywhere, and some new casework's going to be going in there.
This is an example of where the casework was original to the building. And where all of the classrooms had been done and the learning areas, that first year, again, in a more conservative way, some of that did not get replaced. Literally was, really in pretty bad shape, and certainly was not only aesthetically not a pleasing environment, but really the functionality of that. And so really with some minor modifications, that area will be much more conducive to the staff utilizing that space.
And we're going to get PA in that room as well, too. Buchanan, the paving project there looks very nice. We actually do have speed bumps also on the way on that very long stretch.
Good idea.
And we have the paint's already down and the striping.
We
So-
practiced that one too.
Yeah, we did
practiced
that
a
one.
lot,
Did
too.
that one too. Yep. Took the speed bumps at extra high speed just to see how they work. No. In Grant also we have the new paving with the paint down. You can see the shot into the drive coming in and out in the remainder of the parking lot, and then from the very opposite side, kind of coming back towards the building. We did a little bit of nip tuck at Grant with regard to took off a little bit of hard surface around the closer to the building where it was more of a walk area to get it to give more of a radius to the outer parts. And then there's all new sidewalk around that whole curve. So as students, the buses will stack around the next to the building and then make the curve to the left. So that's why you see in the distance a lot of white back there. That's all new sidewalk, so students can get off the bus on the sidewalk and walk around.
Okay.
Hoover paving project from the front of the building, and then from the north side of the building coming back at it. All redone, had not been striped and got the paint yet at the time I took the picture. Nothing really changed there other than having it was renovated, and now it was time for it to have its parking lot redone and smoothed out. Randolph, we've talked about some of the changes that are going on at Randolph. What you're seeing here is their open LMC. On one side, we enclosed it partially with a rounded wall. What you see is the glass, the drywall from the inside and the outside, and the hallway hadn't been drywalled yet, but you can see that there's a lot of window that you can see from the hall through, so you can keep the sight line across, looking very nice. And that's the loft that's within that side of the meeting center. So you can come around to the, this is down on the main level of it, that you walk up the steps, and that's being up there. It's not completely walled off. You can't really tie it into the ceiling there because of the drop ceiling, but we've raised the walls in there for a little more privacy, a little more sound resistance, so you can use it if the building wants to use it for interventions, if the building wants to use it for small groups, whatever they may want to use it for. It gives you a little bit of privacy. But keeping some areas for glass as well, so it's not just a completely walled off area. A couple of areas that they were converting back to classrooms, so you can see just really essentially what you're seeing is a middle wall going up. For example, they had a community room that was one large room because it used to be two classrooms. They simply put that wall back up again and got a teaching wall placed on both rooms because it's classrooms again. And office space, so that we have some areas that's actually the same area, but just you can see that they've painted, they've got the grid going, that's just a temporary light hanging from it because the lights weren't in yet, just getting some office space for different ancillary staff that'll be over at Randolph. And of course, paving, and it looked very nice and smoothed out and started to get its paint on there as well. At Garfield, this is an example of one of the GSRP rooms. If you remember, we had 5 GSRP rooms and 1 Talk It Up room that was done this summer, so it'll be ready for fall. And the rest of Garfield will be the fall project. So on the left, you can see the flooring, you can see the accent wall. You kind of cut off the top, but we weren't really pulling out the lights. What we are doing is making sure that the lights are all the same type of fluorescent. So we have some T12, some T8. We want to get all be T8s. So they'll work on the lighting, the fans that are in a lot of the rooms. This is something that's going to sort of roll into the fall project. So I'm blending some things here as a whole building, but the fans would be replaced, the ceiling fans, etc. But they also need fans for cooling with GSRP. And that was actually more of a storage area. They went through the wall to get a window in there. That's what that is boarded up. So they popped through the masonry to have a window and a air unit below it. So that's just blocked off until it's finished. It's kind of a cool area. I like it's got kind of that exposed brick feel to it.
Are they going to keep that exposed brick? I hope.
I love that
That
exposed
looks
brick,
cool.
yes. And then finally, just some shots of the elementary furniture. It did come in. We're over at Cooper and took a few pictures of the new furniture. You can see you have a separate chair and table. So this is the traditional table and seat for students. And beyond that, we also have on the left, just for comparison's sake, we have the traditional sized on the right table, and that's the high top table on the left.
Standing desk.
The standing desk. And then to the right, we have the hokey stool, which is sort of that weeble wobble, teeter totter type of seat, kind of fun to sit in, and the kids with the wiggles like sitting on those. And behind it is actually a very low table, so children can sit on the floor and have use of the table. So there's multiple seating as well as table choices in the classrooms. Very cool. And that would be the whole project.
Excellent.
Yep.
Questions?
And of course, this isn't every single nook and cranny of every
No.
single building. Tried to just
you
get some
can't.
shots of something that looked of interest.
Yes.
I can't get over how quickly it's all coming together.
Yeah.
My concern is Churchill's music rooms, will those be usable?
Yes.
And they'll have room to store instruments?
That is the plan.
You know, it's separate from the auditorium, but it's still in that same neighborhood.
Yes, yes.
Thank
Yeah, the
you.
Kappa rooms, the vocal, the music, the dance room, the dance studio, all of those are planned to be open for class. I know, it is scary looking at it. Yeah, I know. You look at it and say, okay. But this is the crunch time, and they're gonna work hard to
They
get
always
there.
get it done.
Yeah.
This is somewhat unrelated, but we had discussed earlier in the year a shed for bands. I think it was at Stevenson, right? Is that still going to happen?
Yeah, so the foundation has been poured,
Yep.
and then when the class at LCTC starts back up again in the fall,
Yeah.
then they'll begin construction on
That's
that.
great.
That was, that
Oh, the
was.
class will build
The
it.
the second year
Yes.
construction students, the teacher just said that it would help if they didn't have to pour the concrete for the foundation themselves. They would just burn time doing it and then having it cure, so we had it poured in the summer.
Nice.
And the principal has been very involved with where they wanted it, et cetera, over at Stevenson.
That's great.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Francis.
You're welcome.
Now we can move on to sale of properties.
So you were, this would be the third time we've discussed the sale of the properties. Each time we end up with a little bit more information. One of the things that you were looking for was, last time we were together, what exactly they plan on building. I did come back with some information 2 weeks ago discussing what they were looking to build on those sites, some ideas, some plans, some sites, or some ideas of how many lots will we have and what type of housing it would be. You did receive a memo from me with the site plans from Infinity Homes. So you have in front of you, and I hope that if you had any questions, I hadn't received any earlier, but this is what they're proposing. Of course, we can't tell them after the fact, or it's going to be really between them and the city once we close on this, for the city to approve different plans. But these are pretty traditional items we're looking at. If you take a look at the Perrinville site, they mapped out 34 units. You can see that they're anywhere between groups of 3 to 5, depending on the spot. And most of the units are on Farmington Road. They do have some of the units on Hines. And as we discussed previously, this is going to be a condominium, shared wall, more like townhouse items. Was there anything that you saw on this plan? Okay. If you flip over, the next one should be in your packet, the Nankin/Skill Center property on Ann Arbor Trail. You can count up 78 homes proposed here, and as we discussed previously, they plan to have more like starter homes, but those are still three bedroom minimum, 2-car garage units all throughout, with leaving expanses of open space in this area as well. And just so when you look at it, you can see the little cul-de-sac that's just dangling out. They never want to go beyond.
That's gonna go
the
away.
Yeah, that's why the match line is there.
Okay.
It would go up here.
I was wondering.
Was there any questions on this one that you wanted me to find out? Okay.
Mr. Francis?
Yes.
The rectangles that are white against Ann Arbor Trail, sorry, the font is really tiny.
Those
It
are
says
those are-
parcel.
Yeah, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, are those current?
They're listing 4 parcel numbers.
I think those
They're
are
they're currently there.
properties.
Yeah, the current properties there.
Okay.
This goes around it.
Yeah.
Okay,
Mhm.
got it.
The current properties that are there.
Thank you.
That's what I remember. Actually, it's kind of fun to open up Google Maps and go to the satellite view and sort of lay this next to your screen, which is what I did when I first got them. And yeah, those were parcels, but it's kind of neat to see where this, what's there now and how they're proposing it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Last one is Clay. And as you take a look at Clay, you can see that they have 31 homes on this site plan. And they have some detention over here. And they also left some open space for playground. Pretty much just what they had described in most of these, at least with this Clay property as well as the Nankin and Skill, they had said it's going to be similar to what they've done as far as the properties themselves or the homes themselves is what they've done in Washington. They have a dozen different floor plans that they build around areas, and they're planning to use many of them in these areas.
So at our prior meeting, Mr. Francis had shared with you more specifics about the homes themselves, the number of bedrooms, square footage, et cetera. So those pieces were obviously provided to us initially, and that was all shared with the board. Again, once the board makes a determination on the sale of property, those pieces are then finalized, site plans, et cetera, with the city. But just for the audience listening, we had covered some of those in prior study sessions and committee meetings. And really, the last piece for the board to see was the layout of the site plan itself, where there may be some open space, some green space planned, and then how many sites and homes per parcel.
At this point, we're also, we don't have a finalized agreement of purchase, the document itself. It's being worked on with Ms. Abrams, our counsel, and Infinity Homes. We've seen the draft. The folks at Infinity have seen the draft. I'm scheduled to have a phone call with Ms. Abrams tomorrow morning, just to kind of go back and forth what she's heard back from them in the draft. Essentially, it's the bones of it is the model from the Washington agreement, which took quite some time to hammer out. But since they're starting from an agreed upon point, now it's just a matter of a few different details for these properties. But I think it should be relatively smooth, but I'll have a better update tomorrow morning.
I just want to first say that I know a lot of people that are looking for homes in the area and are having trouble finding homes, especially newer homes that don't need a tremendous amount of work. I think this will create some buzz and excitement for people that live in the LPS district. We've worked with Infinity on Washington, and I've been by and seen what they're doing there. It seems very impressive, and we're very professional in the process. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens here, assuming that the agreement can be reached, and I'm looking forward to having a little more, maybe some young families moving in, and some excitement in the community with new homes coming in.
And the hope would be that we reach an agreement between the administrative team and Infinity, and we have those purchase agreements this week, and bring this to a vote for you for next week to make that decision, so you can see them in advance and have a discussion next week and vote on them.
That'd be great.
Phil, do we know if on any of these three properties, whether they need, whether Infinity Homes is going to need a change in zoning at all?
I can't answer that question definitively because that would be between them and the city. However, the proposed zoning that our consultant laid out was the basic home zoning for each. The plats weren't drawn yet for either the Clay or the Skill Center site, but the old Perrinville site had a previous plat, but I think they have to rework it because they want to plat it differently for
I
what
believe
they're
the same is for Clay. I believe they will be asking for a zoning
rezoning
change for
change.
that. Mhm.
But none of the,
Oh, I'm sorry. So from the school, my apologies. I thought you were talking about
Yeah.
whether it be R2 or R3 or such. Sorry.
yeah, because on the Clay, they seem to put some of the zoning areas around it. They've
I
got
think
a
they're working off an assumption because they're waiting on an agreement with the board before they can proceed further with the city.
As far as you know, there's nothing in the agreement that makes the sale contingent upon a change in zoning.
I did not see that, but I will look through it again and I'll have a conversation with Ms. Abrams tomorrow. But that wasn't something that was contingent that I recall seeing. But again, I'll double check through it.
Okay, appreciate it. Any other questions on the sale of property? Seeing none, we'll move on to lease for Little Tots.
Okay. We have one lease to present to you, and that would be the Little Tots. As we've discussed in the past, they currently have been residing at Clay with their business. We had made an agreement, had many meetings, discussions, walkthroughs to get them into Clay, as we've discussed with the board in the past. We did come to an agreement on the space that they would need. The discussion of increasing their rent amount per square footage was also discussed. We have a game plan in place. We have a higher increase starting on the new lease that would be a September 1 lease and a 10-month lease. So this is prorated. We're keeping it as June 30th through June 30th to keep them on our calendar. So this is a 10-month lease for this term, and then after that it'll be 12. So when you look at the language, you can see the 12-month amount, but then it says, but this is a 10-month lease for a total amount. Doesn't change any dollars in the monthly rate. So the discussions that we had were what areas do they need, and how much are we going to charge, were two of the biggest discussions. We were upfront saying that we're going to have an increase, and we need to continue to have an increase to get them to a per square foot rate that is equivalent to what we would do with a brand-new group or business coming off of the street, using it every day for their business. The agreement was, just so you know, moving forward, that we did the increase of $3 a square foot immediately, starting with this lease, and then we have an agreement for each year after to increase it another $1 each year. So normally we put in the CPI amount, which can be, as low as 1% or as much as 3% usually. That's far more of a jump. So they know what to expect, and we know that we have a timetable to get to a higher rate each year. Also, just to be clear, if you're reading through and you see two different rates per square foot, what occurred was for the open LMC that is at CAS, they need to use it, but they only need to use it sometimes. They would want to use it for poor weather and have some gross motor skill. The gymnasium is not part of their lease, so they would need an area to be able to have the students out because it's not every day, all day type of thing. Came to an agreement, because that's a lot of square footage, and it's just this big area, and if you're getting 1 foot of it, you're getting every foot of it, because it's just a big area. So we came to an agreement that would be charged at half of the per square footage. So it seemed to be a fair agreement between both sides. Every $1 that annual increase for the regular square footage rate, obviously, it's a 50-cent increase on that piece. All in all, they're hoping to grow their business. They did say that they've lost some people in this transition, some families. They're hoping that in time they can grow and grab some more rooms as needed. As that occurs, they add another room or two in the future, it would simply, on a square footage basis, increase whatever we charge them. And there were some questions about, in the past, what's it cost to run the building, maintain the building, et cetera. I mean, the best estimate that we can come up with right now is really just using clay, because it's a similar plan with regard to custodial use and utilities and maintenance, repair, et cetera. And we ran last year's number. Now, this would be for a full year and prorated to a half-time custodian, and it's about $83,000 is what it cost us. And you can see from the amount on the lease, we'd be pulling in almost $80,000 to net after that. So that's not bad. And that's a number that would probably fluctuate from, up and down if something does go wrong. Essentially, they're renting that shell. Anything with that shell that goes wrong is our responsibility. In all our leases, we put in utilities, et cetera. Anything they need for their program, they understand that they have to have that altered or done or brought in if it's for their program at their expense. But if something like the boiler goes, that's LPS's responsibility. But that's no different than anywhere else.
Any questions? President Burton.
Just so the public understands, because we've had conversations off and on, this is talking about renting what we know as the big circle.
Yeah, the big circle,
to
yes.
to the Little Tots, and the little circle is going to continue to be used by various LPS purposes.
Correct. And part of that, we want to keep in mind as well that we're going to have our program in there, in that little circle, a small circle regardless. So we're still going to have a custodian go in there. We're still going to have to turn on the lights. We're still going to have the heat on. So some of these, we throw out a whole building cost at that estimate. Some of that we're going to be we're going to be using up some of that warmth and some of that electricity and whatnot.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Ms. Bonnefield.
And you mentioned that them doing renovations. Do we have any say-so about any renovations?
Yes.
And how does that work?
They clear that through my office, and essentially what they're working on now is to get, because they have to have their licensing and they have to have certain requirements for their licensing to have that daycare. Those are essentially the things that they're working on. A lot of it is, bringing in carpet, getting inspection, some other different things. Whatever they need to get themselves there. They've been working through my office and with Mr. Lau to get in, when they have an appointment, a contractor coming to look at something, we make sure that we are working collaboratively with them to get them in so that she can make her appointments.
There's a section in the contract on page 3, repairs and alterations, where it states the lessee shall not make any alterations, additions, or improvements without the lessor's prior written consent, and then agreed upon by both parties. And so that is our standard lease language, but in this particular case, certainly as the modifications are made that were not there before, are even more important.
Any other questions? Regular agenda?
Please.
Okay.
And just going backwards for a second, the last one with the sale property was regular agenda, pending that we have everything in order.
Yes, if we're ready on that,
Right.
Chair. Okay.
Right. So that's the presumption. So I think we can, if you want to put that, and then we can always contact if anything goes awry in the next couple of days.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Any problem putting it on regular agenda?
No problem.
Okay.
No problem.
Then we'll do so. All right, then, last item, playground update.
I have something to pass out.
Exciting.
Isn't it though? Should I keep one for myself? This item is originally put on to give you an update of what the playground committee worked on last year and where we're heading going into the new school year. But I do have a little bit of an update on the updates. I'll give you a moment to read my memo. Yeah, dead air.
That looks fun.
So I'd like to start with the playground committee, what we've discussed and where we're going, and then get into the requested purchase, if that makes the most sense. Last year, and it's going to continue on this year, but last year we put together a committee consisting of some folks from my department in grounds and maintenance and grounds. We had elementary administrators, special education administrator. We have Mrs. Scott would come when she was able to, the director of elementary, and weigh in. We had 2 PE teachers, because the PE teachers have that background in play structure and use of what occurs. We also, we put that team together and just started discussing, what do we have and where do we want to go? Because in the 2013 bond, there is a line item for dollars for playground. And we knew that we were going to be updating our playgrounds via the bonds. We said, what would we want to do to bring us into a consistent manner of playgrounds across the elementary schools, K-6. So those discussions, we looked at other playgrounds and play structures in different areas, different schools, et cetera, parks, looked at some in Livonia parks, there's some new structures that are beautiful, et cetera. Said, what would be sort of the baseline of a building? Worked through that, looked through some catalogs, had conversations about other types of events. We talked about having some type of walking path at every elementary, regardless of not a traditional track necessarily, it's a quarter mile or an eighth of a mile, but whatever space they had to have a walking track and maybe have some events along those. And what type of play structure would be the norm, and making sure that we have a structure in K4s for like the K1-2s and a different one for the 3/4 graders that might be a little bigger, a little higher up, et cetera. Having gone through all that, we have our first order of business when we come back in September and have a meeting is to nail down the large structures of what we want to start putting, so we can begin to put in place a plan of implementing those structures at the buildings. We have information from our principals and our building supervisors. We've done surveys of them. We've got their information of, people, even those who might do the recess duty and they sort of know what's being used. We ask them questions like, what types of events get used the most? What types of events tend to not get really used? If you really wanted to see something as in your playground structures, what would it be? So we gathered up that type of information along with just the ideas from elementary principal meetings, where a couple of the representatives would always give an update every time they had their elementary principals meeting. They would discuss and bring back some feedback. So we have a nice framework of what we believe with regard to swings, the large playscape, some smaller events, the walking track. We have sort of this idea in place, and now it's a matter of saying that one. That's the structure, and that's where we've got hung up in the busyness of spring, is to be able to actually say, which one do we all want to sort of give the thumbs up to, and then bring it back and say that's what we want to go for. So that's going to be our first order of business, is to say which of these, especially the big structure, what do we want to choose? Because it's very different. Some of the structures are very different than what they've been over the decades.
Sure.
And you get excited and you want to try them, but there's also
But you're too tall.
yes, well, not just that, but there's also they can be more expensive, or is it worth the return? And their longevity could be far greater than the traditional type of structure. So we're hashing it out, and that's going to be item number 1, and item number 2 is going to be, how do we roll that out? If we know what we want to put into the buildings, which buildings are going to have it first, and then next, and then how to phase it in as opposed to potentially doing them all at once. So that brings me to the second portion. We knew going into this spring that we were going to have some removal of structures at the elementary schools, some more than others, based upon the safety of them. We did have them reviewed, and we were given a report saying these need to go. These are not safe any longer. They're old enough to the point where that they don't build them like that anymore, so to speak. Head entrapment potential for something. So we started taking them out. Once they started coming out, we realized that in a few of the buildings,
It's sparse.
it's a little sparse, right? And so you say, well, do we rush and just fill it back up again with everything? And that sort of defeats the purpose of having the plan of what do we want to put in and have it be the same, et cetera. But at the same time, you look and say, we need to get something in there. So we do have 3, maybe 4 buildings that we want to confirm this week exactly, because more have been coming out as the days, just like all the renovation and summer work, more keeps happening during the summer. We did go get quotes on some events that would at least get them in there and give children more opportunity to play. It's something that we can get 30, 35, 40 students if they were at capacity on those smaller items, not the large playscapes. We want to save the large playscapes for what is decided through the bond committee for playgrounds. But it can be an opportunity to say, for some of these smaller events that we're proposing to put at these buildings right away, other buildings can come check it out, and we can look and see, how are these going? What's the event? There's a few of them that are pretty neat. Really, there's something they call a hammock that is actually wonderful for all children, but it's students with special needs can kind of lay across it and use it. We have another one that's a spinner that is not like the old school spinners where we used to try to spin them so fast your friend would come flying off of it. It's just a triple course. But it's more of it's something that you can lounge on. Students can lounge on it or play on it. You can get multiple children on it. It's called the Revolution Inclusive Spinner. So some of these we're excited to see. So what we're proposing is still using the bond. We actually found these items via a consortium, a cooperative, that has already bid out the contract. And we got a quote from them to do these 4 events with the timber, et cetera, and the mats around them. We got a cost of, $28,270.80. That's for the 4 items with freight, the mats, et cetera. That would be for a building. So whether we do 2, 3, 4 of them right away based upon the need, we'd like to be able to purchase that set. It would be the same amount, just times 2 or times 3 or times 4, and get them to the buildings. They won't be there for the first day of school. We know that. This is a 4 to 6 week out, and if the board would consider this, and if the board would consider this at the next regular meeting next Monday, the fastest we could do is quickly turn around the next day, create an emergency PO, and hustle that process. We usually only do it once a week. We could do a PO right away, get it out. At least that starts the clock ticking.
Right, to get it in there fast.
Exactly, to get it in, because that would include installation and everything, but we're hoping that by late September, maybe early October, if nothing goes awry, that we could have it in still for a bulk of the fall. Then we can see them, see how they're being used and utilized, if children like them. If they do, maybe they become a part of the purchase for all the buildings through our planned bond purchase of playground equipment. So that's where we stand today. We know that we're going to have a few buildings, we have buildings that are going to have less than were there when the students left. But we don't want to have it so completely empty that there's only one structure left or something. So we want to get some events out there for the children. And before we jump in, please know that the elementary principals have known this. They've been telling their families all along in the spring. So that definitely has been the message, has been going out for months in the spring before school let out, to give that heads up of, these are coming out, it's for the safety of the children, and we're going to probably see a little bit less of events in the fall. But for those few areas that are hit a little bit harder than others, we'd like to get some more events to replace them as quickly as we can.
Mrs. Oquist, you had.
Thank you. So, again, one of the things we wanted to do was bring this to your attention so that you were aware, as well as to the community that may be watching. Because although, as Mr. Francis said, we've communicated that these pieces needed to be taken out and why, until you see that, and until you come back and realize that taking out 4 or 5 pieces of equipment leaves generally one large play structure and then maybe a few individual pieces or events, as we call them. And it really was pretty striking to us as we began doing those site visits over the past couple of weeks, with some concern of what equipment would be available to students. So a couple of things. One, we thought that this stopgap measure, we certainly have the budget for this. We had put aside a significant budget for exterior playground improvements for our K-6 schools as part of the bond work. That has always been part of the plan. The playground committee will, on a building-based basis, allocate certain dollars to be utilized toward that. We would like to, because we certainly have the money to be able to do that within those funds, to be able to do some of these pieces in addition, because there are some schools which had very little removed. And so we'd like to initially level the playing field a bit and then add on the project that was planned and recommended. The other thing that we've talked about is we do have a really nice amount of individual-based equipment based out of the PEP grant that we've been able to purchase over the years. However, if there are additional pieces, again, that some of those schools need, so whether that's, balls or jump ropes or other types of equipment that get taken out on the carts, games and so on, those are pieces that we'll take a look at and also provide some support for those schools so that there are some additional options for our students out there. We are really excited about what these bond funds will be able to do overall for our playgrounds, including some blacktop improvements, some of the paint, some of the permanent, the painting of whether it's, hopscotch or Foursquare or maps and things like that. We certainly know that our schools need some updates in that regard as well. So we have a lot that is being planned. What we didn't want to do was just rush out and assume that, for instance, we put a playscape in at Cleveland about 2 years ago, I think, this fall. Was it? I don't think it was last fall. I think it was the year before. We certainly could have replicated something like that and brought that forward, but in that case, that school would all likelihood not have been able to be involved in a more significant structure of their choosing as we move forward. And so we thought it best to be able to bring forward just a few additional options where we have some really bare areas. And these are pieces we're able to get in pretty short order. And so that, combined with some of the individual play equipment and options, would be some things we'd like to do at least for the first few months. And then some of those schools would be at the top of the list, as Mr. Francis said, to be able to get the greater improvement as we go over the course of the year.
Questions? Mrs. Bonnefield.
I know this kind of breaks protocol a little bit, but I know we've done it a couple times. Is there any way we can get a board consensus and get this in?
Get it ready to go.
Get things in motion so that we can maybe move things a week
Let me ask,
ahead.
does that help?
Save 6 or 7 days.
Does it? Okay.
But I don't want to, it's up to the board.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
If we have a consensus and then, because a week for these kids it's a
big
week.
difference.
That's a long time. If we can move the process up a week and have a consensus and then obviously take the formal vote, at least the paperwork could get started and the POs could get produced and the process could start moving a week
Well,
at a time.
let's see if we have any questions and hold that thought until we see if there are any questions.
Oh, so you're saying maybe 3 or 4 schools would get this particular
Correct.
configuration?
Correct. That, and it would be the same.
At
so
all
we
4
know,
schools?
it's just whatever, that amount, the 28.
Per school, that'd be per school.
Per school, that would be done at each spot with these 4 items, because they're all K-4 buildings that were hit harder. The 5-6s didn't have the removals like a few of the K-4s.
Can I ask you what that tall thing is? Is that you just jump on that?
So you
and
hang
it
on
spins
it,
around?
and
it goes around?
And it spins around.
And then the one in the upper left, even though this is trying to be 3-dimensional, that's like the hammock
Yeah, you
type
climb
item.
on that.
Yep.
So you
And
can
then
climb it, you
Yep.
can lay on it.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the teeter is looks like a little car in the back, and kids can kind of
That's-
I know like the
that's the
third and
new
fourth
teeter
graders like to
totter.
just kind of hang on things, and the little ones like to climb around a little more, but that's something you can do both. And then this is the spinner. And when you see it as a real, like this is obviously computer generated, but it's more like not a slide, but it looks like almost like a lounge. Each of those seats that you've seen with the high back is almost like a loungy sloping section that a
And
child
then
can
they
just
spin
kind
it like
of
that.
lay in it sideways, and
sit
kids
and
just
spin,
sort of
isn't
climb around it and play around on it.
My question is just, I don't know anything about playground equipment, so can we reallocate some of the stuff at like CAS, because CAS is closing? Can some of that stuff go to some of the schools that are really sparse? Or can you reallocate, or it's so far down on the ground you can't lift it up? and-
Most of the time, the larger structures are not.
But smaller structures, just to give them something if
And
they're bare?
we are looking at that.
Yeah, we identified a few pieces in a few locations that we've inquired if you can maintain the integrity of the equipment.
Can you relocate it?
If you reinstalled that somewhere else. I will tell you, generally, for the most part, it is often not worth the cost to challenge the integrity of that item. There are a couple of pieces that they did identify that they may be able to move. The other pieces, we want to be cognizant too that for some of the things that we have in place at the schools where we closed, that partially for the use of the community and then partially for the use of the programs there, we want to be conscious of what we leave available. So where we may not do replacements such as this at those schools, it may be, in the cost-benefit analysis of that, better to leave those pieces there. There are some pieces within a setting, I believe Buchanan is an example, where they may be looking to have all of their playground use be behind the school rather than having students cross the parking lot and use that front section. So there's a couple pieces out there that they believe that they may be able to move to the back. So that may be more likely than from school to school.
And then once you move to the bigger ones, you have, if you have compromised it, now you've got a liability of a compromised structure, so sometimes it's not worth doing, yeah.
Mr. Centers, you had a question?
No, it was covered.
It was
Thank you.
covered. Mrs. Bonnefield, did you have
No,
another?
I said my piece.
Okay.
I have a question.
President Burton.
Mr. Francis, you may have already covered this. If I apologize if I missed it. I see that these are available through the National Joint Powers Alliance Cooperative Purchasing Contract. Does that then waive our obligation to go out and competitively bid
Correct.
this?
It's been bid through a contract.
Okay.
I've spoken with Allison Smith, and we confirmed that the purchase of it would be appropriate because obviously the amount is at a board approval
Right.
level and the need to have that. So we can either do a full bid, which would be time-consuming.
Right.
Or because this is something is sort of a stopgap, but at the same time, I'm a little excited to say we can get some pieces in and sort of kick the tires, so to speak. We can do it legitimately and legally.
Okay, great. And for the public doesn't see the document we have, which also reflects an additional 13% discount for Livonia Public Schools.
Correct. They did give us an additional discount above and beyond. So they can, once they get a consortium or a contracted group and they get their price bid through there, it's up to them if they want to even go lower than that. That's legitimate. What you can't do, though, is take their price to another company and say, hey, beat this.
Who is not on the
Who's not in
consortium
the
process.
consortium.
So this certainly meets all the, it's a good question, meets all of the guidelines required for us for bidding.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? So you're asking to buy 4 structures at this time, right?
As pictured
sets.
here,
4 sets.
those 4 structures with the mats and freight, et cetera, that comes with that package, the question right now is, and we need to confirm probably tomorrow or at the latest Wednesday while we're getting this together, is how many buildings, which buildings specifically. We have an idea.
We believe we've confirmed 3, but
yes.
we want to be certain
Correct.
that one additional may
And
be
it takes
needed.
getting out there and actually putting eyes on it.
So is there a chance we're only going to do 3, or are we going to do 4?
3 or 4, how about we say that?
Okay.
Yeah.
Up to 4.
Up to 4.
Okay. Mrs. Jarvis?
Thank you. Each of these buildings, whether it's 3 or 4, will get all 4 of these
Correct, it'd be the
spaces?
same configuration.
Okay. Then do we have a consensus to have Mr. Francis go ahead and get the ball rolling on that?
Yes, I agree.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I would agree with that.
Yes.
Okay.
And then we'll put this on for the next regular meeting.
Thank you.
That'd be great.
Good
Okay.
idea, Tammy.
Just a week for these kids is,
All right, so President Burton, that concludes building and site.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
very
Mr.
much.
Francis.
The next item on our agenda this evening is item 5, Finance Committee, and I will turn the meeting over to Mrs. Bonnefield.
Thank you, President Burton. Mrs. Smith has given us a little different fare today, as not so much on the budget. We're going to cover bills for payment process, and we are also going to cover tuition rate, which is a yearly kind of check the box sort of thing. So, Mrs. Smith, if you can do bills for payment process, that would be great.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mrs. Bonnefield. Just to summarize, we had a very good discussion at our last study session. Took a look at what our current bills for payment process is. Just to summarize, we had determined that we're currently bringing a list of bills for payment and including that as a consent agenda item for our regular board meetings for the board's approval. And as we discussed at our study session, that's not required by law, nor is it required by our own board policy. We are required for transparency reporting to post on our website a check register of the bills for payment for the last school year. So after the discussion we had, I wanted to bring forward a recommendation for you. And the recommendation would be to change how this information is being presented to the board and our community. And instead of bringing it to the board in our regular meetings, the business office would run a system-generated check register and post that onto our website on a monthly basis under our transparency page. There's an icon on our main page too, so it's very easy to get to. And then we would take feedback from the board as well as our community over the next couple of months to see how this new process is going, and then revisit it with the board in the next couple of months just to make sure it's still meeting everybody's needs. So I know at our study session we had talked about the ability to tweak the report and if we could include some different things. It isn't possible at this time. If it does become something that the county is able to prepare for us, I definitely bring that back to the board and give you an update on that. But that's what we had discussed last week, so I wanted to bring that forward as a recommendation to implement for the 17-18 school year.
Okay. Any questions or comments? Mr. Centers?
So just as a little further explanation, what kinds of material or what kind of information would they be able to gain by going on the website and seeing this register?
Sure. It would be a list of all of the vendors that we have cut a check to in the previous year. So you would see the vendor, you'd see the day the check was cut, as well as the dollar amount.
Great.
So.
Thank you.
Other questions? Mrs. Smith, when you say in the last year, is it a rolling 12 months or is it by school year?
What's required under the transparency reporting is for it to be for the last school year. So at a minimum, we'd have to post 16-17's information out there. But what I'm recommending is, so the information is more current for the board and for the community, that we would post it on a monthly basis. So if you looked out on our transparency page, you'd see a register for the 16-17 year, and then you'd also see below that the July register, and then the August register. And then each year, we'd put out an annual one, and then put the current year with that month out there.
Okay. And I understand that this is going to be not only maybe easier to read, because some of the stuff that we're producing right now is a lot of superfluous information on it that it isn't necessarily, we're not able, there's a lot of information on there that it makes it really a little difficult to read.
Yeah.
And also that this is a cost-saving measure for your office, I understand.
It sure is. So this is the new process to put the check register out on our website. Will probably take 5 minutes, maybe 10 at the most. And right now, it's a report that we download into Excel, and then there's some manipulation and some information we add to it. So, and then, getting it ready for the board and everything like that, I would say it easily is maybe 5 hours of work, a month for the various staff that touch it. So this would definitely be a time saver for the staff.
Okay, and I think in addition to that, there's also it consumes a large amount of paper to produce it for us, and also there's probably other time that's spent on compiling the paper and getting it all together. So there are some additional cost savings in there.
Correct.
Okay, and if the board is reviewing the check register and we find something that we need a little more information, or the general public, how would they go about maybe asking the question, or if we have concerns about the different, that the information is a little different than what we're used to seeing, and how would we maybe go about dealing with those concerns on specific items?
That is a great question, and I would recommend if the board has any questions, or if the public has any questions, they can contact my office, a phone call or an email, whatever is easiest. But we've, in the last couple of years, started scanning all of our checks that we cut that include backup, and it shows all the approvals, who approved the payment, shows budget codes, of various information. So it's very easy. If somebody had a specific question or wanted additional information about a payment, we'd be happy to share that information.
Okay. All right. I think one of the things that we talked about at our last session was that sometimes when we change what we're providing to either the board or the community, that there are some questions, but this is definitely one of those cost-saving measures that we can do. Hopefully the information is going to be actually a little more readable than it was in the past, and that although there's a difference in the presentation, that the same information is available if we need it.
Correct.
So,
Correct. Yep.
just a little change in procedure to help us with our time.
Yeah.
Mrs. Oakles.
Thank you. So just to review, one of the things that we covered at the study session was the process that we utilize now and the process that we're recommending both far exceed the transparency requirements as required by law. And so what we are looking to do are two things: to have the information be timely and readily available for the essential information both to the board and to our community that would be easily accessible on our site under the transparency page. Additionally, if there are questions regarding the change in format, et cetera, this is something that Mrs. Smith has studied and looked at in numerous districts throughout the state and throughout the county. And the format that we're utilizing and the program that we're utilizing through our ISD is one that's very commonly used in districts across the area. And so it provides appropriate information and provides the information beyond the requirements by law. And so we're confident that this will give the necessary information to our community and certainly to our board. Our goal is to have the information current, readily available, and easily understandable. And we believe that this process being recommended accomplishes all three of those goals.
Thank you. President Burton.
I'm in favor of putting the information on the website, and I am fine with it not coming through the board, because really the board, putting this on a consent agenda, we don't have the backup on checks and so forth, so it's really rather a rote exercise. So I'm fine with us utilizing our website in order to get this information out to our public, and frankly, it can go out to our public even in a more timely manner because they don't have to wait for a board meeting and board approval. I am very glad that we're going to try this for a few months, get some feedback, and come back and revisit it and take a look and make sure that we still are happy with this process. The only concern that I still do have is without having any notation as to what that expenditure was for, gives me a bit of concern. I'd like to know over the next few months how many questions we have from the public on those items, and how many questions we have from board members on those items, so we can find out if we wind up spending more time answering those questions than we would have utilizing the current system. I'm not necessarily saying we go back to the current system, but perhaps we do look for a different method that would allow us to also include some explanation of the expenditure of those funds. That's the only piece that gives me concern is the lack of explanation on the expenditure.
That is a wonderful idea. We'll definitely track the number of questions that we get and then report that back to the board.
And if in the meantime, I know we discussed at our study session, the fact that right now there is not an easily usable program that we could put onto our website that would include that right now. If you do come upon one, if you could bring that information back to the board also, that would be fabulous.
I'd be happy to.
Because I know you study a lot of things going on in a lot of districts, and that's appreciated. Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Okay, that is going to wrap item A, bills for payment. I want to thank Mrs. Smith again on that particular item as she continues to try and make our process as smooth and cost-effective as possible. Yes,
Mrs.
ma'am.
Bonnefield, there is no action at this time.
Oh, I am sorry.
Correct?
No, this is just all informational.
Correct. Thank you.
Okay, and then we're going to move on to the tuition rate for 17-18, and we'll talk about that.
Sounds good, thank you. So Michigan compiled law 380.1401 reads that the board of a school district may admit non-resident pupils to the schools of the district, and the board shall determine the rates of tuition of the non-resident pupils and shall collect tuition. So in general, the district doesn't accept non-residents on a tuition basis, but there are certain cases where we would make the exception, and our current board policy allows for that. The most common example being Livonia student that's moved out of our district, right before their senior year. We would allow that student to be able to finish off their senior year. So the calculation for the tuition is pretty straightforward formula. We take our general fund operating expenditures and we divide that by the number of students, and that's for the previous year. And then we come up with a dollar amount. So for this year, for 17-18, that comes out to $9,812. And when you compare that with the prior 3 years, on average, the 3-year average was $9,810, so within $2, so not much of a change. And how that's collected, we collect from the families the difference between the foundation allowance we receive from the student and then the tuition amount that we've calculated for them. So the full $9,800 isn't collected. What is collected is the difference between our foundation allowance and the tuition that we've calculated.
Questions? Any? Okay, are we okay to put this on the consent agenda? We usually do.
I'm fine with that.
Are we good?
Yeah.
We'll just,
Yes.
okay.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that concludes the Finance Committee.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Smith.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next item on our agenda is item 6, Policy Committee. I see no items there. Mrs. Frank, is there anything you know of? Mrs. Oquist?
No, thank you.
All righty. Next item is item 7, Personnel Committee. Mr. Senders, I don't have any items. Do you know anything?
No.
I do not.
No? All righty. And lastly, item 8 is Legislative Committee. Mrs. Jarvis?
Nothing at this time.
Nothing? All righty. And Mrs. Oquist, nothing for Legislative?
No,
All righty.
thank you, President Burton.
That brings us to the end of our agenda this evening. We thank those of you who have hung in there with us, and we invite you back to our next meeting next week for our voting or general meeting, as one would call it. We are now adjourned. Thank you. Have a nice evening.